There is a city that people use as a punchline. When something is far away, impossibly distant, almost fictional in its remoteness, someone will say it. They will wave a hand and say, "That's about as far as Timbuktu." And everyone laughs because Timbuktu sounds made up. It sounds like the name a child would give to an imaginary place on a crayon map. It sounds like the end of the world, the edge of knowing, the place where the map runs out and someone has written, simply, "Here be nothing." But Timbuktu is real. It exists right now, as you listen to this, on the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, in the country of Mali, in West Africa. You could find it on a map. You could, theoretically, book a flight. It sits there, patient and ancient, having endured centuries of being treated like a myth by the very world that once feared its name. And here is the thing that most people never learn. The thing that gets swallowed by the joke, buried under the punchline and forgotten. Timbuktu was not always a dusty edge of nowhere outpost. It was not always a symbol of remoteness. For more than 150 years, Timbuktu was one of the wealthiest, most intellectually sophisticated, most awe-inspiring cities on the face of the earth. It was a place where scholars came from across the known world to study, where manuscripts were stacked floor to ceiling in private libraries so vast that their owners could not read everything they possessed in a single lifetime, where salt traded for its weight in gold, and gold was so abundant that visiting merchants returned home with stories no one believed. It was a city that made Europe look provincial, a city that existed and thrived and burned with civilization at a time when much of the rest of the world was still groping in the dark. And then it fell, not quickly, not in a single dramatic fire or flood or war. It fell the way great things often fall, slowly, then suddenly, first by conquest, then by neglect, then by the slow, grinding weight of centuries, until the sand crept in from the desert and began to reclaim what had once been the most famous city no one believed in. Tonight, we are going to trace that entire arc. We are going to begin before the city existed, when the land itself was shaping the conditions that would make Timbuktu possible. We are going to move through its birth, through its golden age, through the empires that claimed it, and the scholars who loved it, and the conquerors who broke it. We are going to follow it into its long decline and into the strange, haunting present, where it still stands, diminished and half-buried, waiting for the world to remember what it was. This is going to take some time. There is a lot of ground to cover, several centuries of it, and every era has its own texture, its own characters, its own particular quality of light. We are going to move slowly, because this story deserves to be moved through slowly. Because the best way to understand a place that has been dismissed as mythical is to sit inside its history long enough to feel it breathe. So settle in. Let whatever tension you are carrying begin to loosen. If the world outside is loud, let it become background. What we are entering now is older than most of the noise that surrounds us, and it has a patience to it, a deep stillness that comes from having survived for so long. And before we go any further, I want to say something to whoever is listening right now in the dark. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing this. There is something I find genuinely moving about the idea of someone lying still, listening to a story about a city that most people dismiss. A city that was magnificent and is now mostly forgotten. You are doing something the world does not always reward, which is paying careful attention to a thing that deserves it. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. We begin not with the city, but with the river. The Niger River is one of the great rivers of the world, though it does not always get the recognition it deserves. It rises in the mountains of Guinea, in the far west of Africa, and then it does something unusual for a major river. Instead of flowing straight to the sea, it curves. It bends north and east in a great arc, moving toward the Sahara Desert, pushing into land that should by all logic be inhospitable, before eventually turning south and east again, and finally emptying into the Gulf of Guinea on the Atlantic coast. This arc, this great inland bend, is called the Niger Bend, and for the people who lived along its banks, it was the difference between survival and death. Because the Niger carried water into a landscape that had almost none, it flooded seasonally, retreating to leave behind rich, dark silt in which crops could grow. It provided fish. It provided a highway along which boats could travel, carrying goods and people and ideas from one place to another. At the top of that bend, at the northernmost point, where the river curves closest to the Sahara, there is a place, a flat, unremarkable plain, slightly elevated, just enough to be above the seasonal floods, just enough to be dry when the river retreated, and wet enough to sustain life when it rose. This is where Timbuktu would eventually be built. But before any city existed there, this place was simply a meeting point, a seasonal campsite, a spot where the people of the Sahara and the people of the Sahel, the semi-arid grassland south of the desert, could converge during certain times of year. The Sahara has not always been a desert. Thousands of years before our story begins, it was green. There were lakes and rivers and grasslands across the land that is now sand. Animals grazed, people farmed. Then, gradually, the climate shifted. The rains retreated, the vegetation died, the lakes dried up, and the people who had lived in the Sahara were faced with a choice. They could move south, toward the river, toward the moisture, toward the Sahel, or they could adapt. Some moved, some stayed and became nomads, following the scarce water sources, learning the desert's rhythms the way a musician learns a complicated piece of music, learning which paths led to wells, which seasons brought rain to which corners, which rocks held shade and which held scorpions. These desert people, particularly the Tuareg and the Berber peoples of the Western Sahara, became extraordinary travelers and traders. They learned to move across the desert with camels, those magnificent, improbable animals that can go days without water and carry heavy loads across burning sand without complaint. They learned to read the stars, to navigate by them across featureless plains of dune and rock. They carried goods back and forth across the Sahara, linking the Mediterranean world of North Africa with the sub-Saharan world of West Africa. And what did they carry? From the south, they carried gold. The region south of the Sahara, what the Arabic geographers would later call the land of gold, was extraordinarily rich in the metal. It came from rivers and from mines, gathered by people who had been working gold for centuries before any outsider arrived to trade for it. They also carried slaves, which is a brutal and important truth of this story. The trans-Saharan trade was not only an exchange of goods and ideas, it was also one of the oldest and largest forced migration systems in human history. Enslaved people were taken from West African communities and marched north across the desert to the markets of North Africa and the Middle East. This is not a peripheral detail, it is woven into the fabric of Timbuktu's rise, part of the economic engine that made the city's wealth possible, and any honest telling of this history must hold both things at once, the magnificence and the cruelty, the libraries and the slave markets, the scholarship and the suffering. From the north, across the desert, came salt. This seems like an odd trade to anchor a civilization to, but salt was not a seasoning in this world. It was a necessity. In a hot climate, without refrigeration, without the 100 modern methods of food preservation we take for granted, salt was the difference between food that kept and food that rotted. Salt preserved meat. Salt preserved fish. Salt balanced the human body's desperate need for minerals lost through constant sweating in the heat. Salt was medicine. Salt was survival. And the Sahara had enormous deposits of it. At a place called Teghaza, in the middle of the desert, there was so much salt that the people who lived there built their houses from it, literally. Walls of salt, roofs of salt, a town built from the very thing that made the trade route profitable. Slabs of salt were cut from the earth, loaded onto camels, and carried south. When they arrived at the markets along the Niger, they were worth their weight in gold. Not metaphorically, actually, quite literally. The exchange rate between salt and gold fluctuated over the centuries, but they were measured against each other, weighed against each other, and for long periods, they were roughly equivalent in value. This is the trade that created Timbuktu. Not the city itself, not yet, but the conditions for it. The meeting of north and south, the exchange of salt and gold and everything else that moved along these routes, needed a hub, a place where caravans could rest, where merchants could store goods, where negotiations could happen, where the infrastructure of commerce, the warehouses and the wells and the brokers and the interpreters could concentrate. The spot at the top of the Niger bend was perfect. close enough to the river to be accessible to the river traders from the south, close enough to the desert to be a natural stopping point for the caravans from the north, on slightly elevated ground, safe from flooding, sheltered slightly from the worst of the desert winds. Someone, sometime in the late 11th or early 12th century, made a more permanent camp there. The stories differ about who it was and why. The most famous tradition says it was a Tuareg woman, an old woman named Timbuktu, who was left behind to tend the camp while the men of her group moved with their herds. The camp was a well and a few shelters, and people began to refer to it by a phrase that meant, roughly, the place belonging to Timbuktu. In the Tuareg language, tin is a prefix indicating possession or belonging to. Timbuktu, Timbuktu. Whether or not this etymology is accurate, whether or not Timbuktu was a real person, the story has survived because it captures something true about the place. It was, at its origin, a practical stop, a functional point on a functional route. There was nothing grand about it yet, nothing inevitable. It was just a place where people stopped, and then kept stopping, and then began to stay. The empire that first gave Timbuktu its shape was Ghana, not the modern country of Ghana, which lies several hundred miles to the south and east. The Ghana Empire occupied the region between the Niger and Senegal rivers, in what is now southern Mauritania and western Mali. The word Ghana was not actually the name of the land, but a title, a word for the king, the war chief, the one who commanded. To outsiders, the title became the name of the whole kingdom. Ghana was old, extraordinarily old. Arab geographers were writing about it as a major power as early as the 8th century, and the kingdom itself likely predates that. It grew rich in the same way that later West African states would grow rich, by controlling the trade in gold from the south, levying taxes on every slab of salt and every nugget of gold that passed through its territory. The king of Ghana reportedly kept a palace of extraordinary opulence. His court included a royal dog, whose neck bore a golden collar. When the king held audience, he sat under a great pavilion decorated with silk from the Muslim north, and his courtiers wore gold ornaments and fine robes. Visitors described a civilization that was, by any standard of the era, sophisticated and wealthy. But Ghana did not control Timbuktu directly. The city that would become Timbuktu was still only a waypoint, still in the process of becoming, and Ghana itself was weakening by the 11th century. A reformed Islamic movement from the Western Sahara, a group called the Almoravids, swept south and east, disrupting the trade networks, destabilizing the political structures that Ghana depended on. The empire fragmented. Into that fragmentation came something new, a people from the banks of the Niger itself, the Manda-speaking peoples of the region, and particularly a group that the Arabic sources call the Mandinka or Malinke. From their heartland south of the bend of the Niger, they would build something extraordinary. But before we get there, we should understand the landscape, the physical and human geography of the region, because it shapes everything that follows. The Sahel, the zone south of the Sahara, is not a single uniform environment. It grades from the near desert in the north, where only the hardiest grasses and scrub trees survive, to richer savanna in the south, where there is enough rain for real agriculture, for millet and sorghum, for yams and plantains, for the kind of settled farming life that can support dense populations. Between these zones, the Niger does its remarkable work. Its annual floods create a unique ecosystem, an inland delta where water spreads across an enormous flat plain, creating a kind of seasonal lake full of fish and supported by extraordinary wetland vegetation. People fish here. They farm the rich silt. They raise cattle on the grasses that grow in the flood's wake. It is, even today, one of the most productive ecosystems in West Africa. Timbuktu sits at the northern edge of this productive zone, the last point before the land becomes truly desert, the gateway between the world of the river and the world of the sand. It is this position, this threshold quality, that made it the place where exchanges happened. The people of the desert had things the people of the river wanted. The people of the river had things the people of the desert needed, and Timbuktu was where they met. Now, into this world, into this centuries-old web of exchange and movement, came a young man named Sundiata Keita. Sundiata's story is one of the great heroic narratives of West African history, told and retold by the griots, the professional historians and storytellers who preserved the oral traditions of the Mande people across generations. Like all great heroic narratives, it mixes the historical and the legendary so thoroughly that separating them is less interesting than simply letting the story breathe. He was born a prince, the son of a king of a small Mande kingdom. His mother was a woman of enormous character, chosen for the king by a prophecy. But Sundiata himself was, in childhood, considered worthless. He was unable to walk. He dragged himself along the ground. His mother was mocked, and she and her crippled son were pushed to the margins of the court, forgotten by the men who mattered. Then, according to the tradition, something happened. The young Sundiata, moved by his mother's humiliation, determined to stand. He requested an iron rod, and he used it to push himself upright, and he walked. The griots described this moment with a kind of electric intensity, the moment when everyone who had dismissed the prince realized their mistake. He grew up to be a warrior of extraordinary ability and a political mind of unusual sophistication. When a conqueror from the northeast, a king named Sumanguru Kante of the Soso people, swept through the region and destroyed the remaining power structures of the old Ghana Empire, it was Sundiata who organized the resistance. In 1235, at a place called Kirina, Sundiata's forces met Sumanguru's army. The battle was decisive. Sumanguru was defeated and disappeared. Some say fleeing, some say transformed by magic into a rock, the legend accommodating the human need for a villain's ending to be somehow appropriate to his villainy. From that victory, Sundiata began building what would become the Mali Empire, and the Mali Empire would be the first great political structure to fully incorporate and transform Timbuktu. Under Mali, the city began to grow. It was no longer merely a campsite or a seasonal market. It was a permanent settlement, a town with mosques and markets, and a population that included not only local Mande and Tuareg people, but merchants from Morocco and Egypt, and as far away as Arabia. Islam had been moving into West Africa along the trade routes for centuries, carried by merchants who prayed 5 times a day wherever they found themselves, and who built mosques wherever they settled long enough to need one. By the time of Mali, Islam was the religion of the merchant class, the educated elite, the political structure. This mattered enormously for Timbuktu's future, because Islam, more than almost any other religious tradition of the medieval world, placed learning at its center. The Prophet had reportedly said that the pursuit of knowledge was obligatory for every Muslim, that seeking knowledge, even to the farthest corners of the earth, was a duty. The great intellectual tradition of the Islamic world, the libraries of Baghdad and Cairo and Cordoba, the hospitals and observatories and philosophical schools, all of this flowed from a religious culture that treated scholarship as a form of worship. And so as Islam took root in Timbuktu, it brought with it not just prayer rugs and mosques, but books, scholars, the infrastructure of learning, the idea that a city could be a center of knowledge, not just a center of trade. These two things, trade and learning, would define Timbuktu for the next several centuries. They would feed each other in ways that made the city something genuinely remarkable, because the scholars needed income, and the merchants provided it, and the merchants needed legitimacy, needed a cultured, Islamically sophisticated identity to operate in the wider Muslim world, and the scholars provided that. Gold paid for manuscripts. Manuscripts attracted scholars. Scholars attracted more merchants. More merchants meant more gold. It was a virtuous cycle, and it was just beginning. The Mali Empire's greatest king was not Sundiata himself, but a man who came several generations later. His name was Mansa Musa, and he ruled from roughly 1312 to 1337, and he performed an act that introduced the world outside Africa to the existence of West African wealth, in a way that no one who witnessed it ever forgot. He went on pilgrimage to Mecca. This was not unusual for a Muslim king. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to the holy city, was a religious obligation, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and powerful rulers across the Muslim world made this journey as a demonstration of faith and an opportunity to be seen, to be known, to enter the networks of the wider Islamic world. What was unusual was the scale. Mansa Musa set out with a caravan of, by various accounts, between 60,000 and 80,000 people. This number strains credibility when you first encounter it, but consider what it represented. There were soldiers for protection across the long desert route. There were servants and administrators, because a king cannot simply pack a bag. There were wives and their attendants. There were merchants taking advantage of the route. There were scholars and imams and religious functionaries. There were slaves and enslaved people carrying supplies. And there were 12,000 enslaved people who were reportedly there specifically to carry gold, each one bearing a staff of solid gold and a bundle of trade goods. Mansa Musa reportedly carried 80 to 100 camel loads of gold dust. He carried additional weight in coin and in bullion. He traveled through the Sahara to Cairo, where he spent so lavishly, gave so freely, distributed gold to beggars and scholars, and anyone who approached him with sufficient deference, that he actually destabilized the Egyptian economy. The value of gold in Cairo dropped sharply after his visit, and reportedly did not recover for more than a decade. A single man's generosity created a decade-long recession in one of the most powerful cities on earth. He moved on through Arabia. He saw Mecca. He returned home through a different route, passing through the great cultural centers of the Islamic world, collecting scholars and architects and artists as other men might collect souvenirs. One of these was a man named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, an Andalusian architect and poet from what is now Spain, who had fled the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula and found his way to Mecca. Mansa Musa was charmed by him. He brought him back to Mali with an astronomical salary, reportedly 200 pounds of gold for the journey alone, and set him to work. Al-Sahili built things in Timbuktu. He built a grand royal palace, long since vanished, and a mosque. His architectural style, the Moroccan and Andalusian influence he carried with him from the Islamic West, merged with local Saharan building traditions to create something new. The adobe architecture that would become characteristic of Timbuktu, the mud brick construction with the distinctive wooden beams projecting from the walls like spines, the tall tapering minarets, all of this developed from this moment of contact and exchange. The Jingareba Mosque, which Al-Sahili is credited with founding, still stands today. It has been rebuilt and restored many times over the centuries, as mud brick construction requires constant maintenance against the elements, but it stands. You can visit it. You can put your hand on walls that trace a lineage back to a moment in the 14th century when a king returned from pilgrimage with an architect and a vision. After Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, the world outside Africa could no longer pretend it did not know about West African wealth. Mansa Musa appeared on the Catalan Atlas of 1375, a great European map of the known world, sitting on a golden throne holding a golden scepter, a nugget of gold in one hand. The cartographers labelled his kingdom's territory with a description of his gold and his power. Europeans began asking about the land south of the Sahara with a new kind of hunger. Timbuktu itself became, in European imagination, a city of gold, a place where the buildings were made of the stuff, where it lay in the streets, where a traveller could arrive poor and leave rich. This was an exaggeration, but exaggerations often carry a kernel of something true, and the kernel here was that Timbuktu was extraordinary, that it was richer and more sophisticated than most of the world knew, that it deserved attention. Unfortunately, the attention it would eventually receive would not be the kind the city needed. Let us stay, for now, in the Golden Age. Let us spend some time inside the city at its height, during the 15th and early 16th centuries, when it was at its most brilliant. Timbuktu, at its peak, had a population of somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people. This was enormous for the era, comparable to London or Paris at the same time. It was larger than any city in the Americas, larger than most European cities. It was, by any reasonable measure, a major world metropolis. The city was organized around its mosques and its markets, the Jingareba Mosque in the south, the Sankore Mosque in the north, the Sidi Yahya Mosque in the center. These were not merely places of worship, though they were that. They were also schools, libraries, community centers, the organizing nodes around which the intellectual and social life of the city clustered. The Sangkor Mosque, in particular, had evolved into something unprecedented. Around it had grown a university, or what functioned as one, though it lacked the formal administrative structure of European universities of the same period. Students gathered around particular scholars, paying for instruction through arrangements with their teachers, living in the houses and neighborhoods surrounding the mosque. They studied the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence, of course, but they also studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, poetry, rhetoric, logic. They debated, they wrote, they copied manuscripts and created new ones. The University of Sangkor is estimated to have had, at its height, around 25,000 students. In a city of perhaps 100,000 people, this meant that roughly 1 in 4 people was engaged in formal learning of some kind. The proportion is astonishing. It made Timbuktu one of the most literate, most educated places on earth at a time when most of the world's population could not read. And the books. We need to talk about the books. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are one of the great underappreciated wonders of world cultural history. They exist. They survive, many of them, to this day, though their survival has been threatened repeatedly and continues to be threatened. There are estimated to be somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million manuscripts in Timbuktu and the surrounding region, held in private collections, in family libraries, in the basements and sealed rooms of houses that have stood for centuries. These are not simple documents, they are books, carefully made, often beautifully illustrated, written in Arabic and sometimes in the Ajami script, which is Arabic letters used to write African languages. They cover every subject the medieval Islamic world considered worth writing about: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, philosophy, grammar, poetry, history, theology. There are books about the movement of the stars, and books about the treatment of diseases, and books about the proper conduct of trade, and books about the interpretation of dreams. There are love poems, there are political treatises, there are letters between scholars debating fine points of jurisprudence with an intellectual rigor that matches anything produced in the great universities of medieval Europe at the same time. There are histories of local dynasties, of the Niger Bend, of the great trade routes, of the families and the empires and the cities that rose and fell. There is a book that attempts to calculate the circumference of the earth. There are books that discuss the idea that the earth moves around the sun, predating European heliocentrism. There are medical texts that describe treatments for conditions that European medicine would not address for another century or two. This is what Timbuktu was. This is what the punchline conceals: a city of books. A city where knowledge was the most valuable commodity, even more valuable than the gold and salt that paid for it. The scholars of Timbuktu understood themselves as custodians of civilization. They believed, with a deep seriousness, that the preservation and transmission of knowledge was among the highest callings available to a human being. They copied manuscripts. They collected them. They brought them from Egypt and Morocco and the Arabian Peninsula. They produced new ones. They taught from them. They debated over them. They argued about their meanings and contested their interpretations with the fierce intellectual passion of people who know that ideas matter. One of the most important of these scholars was a man named Ahmad Baba al-Masufi al-Timbukti. Ahmad Baba was born in 1556 and lived until 1627, a long life that spanned some of the most tumultuous decades in Timbuktu's history. He was, by any measure, one of the great scholars of his age, anywhere in the world. He wrote more than 40 books on topics ranging from Islamic jurisprudence to biography to grammar. He had a personal library of over 1,600 manuscripts, which he described as the smallest library in his family, suggesting the scale at which books were accumulated and treasured in this city. Ahmad Baba's life, as we will see, was interrupted violently. But before that violence arrived, let us sit with him for a moment in the Timbuktu of his early years. Let us imagine the city as he knew it. It is early morning. The air is cool, briefly, before the desert heat reasserts itself. The muezzin's call floats from the minaret of the Sangkor Mosque, unfurling across the flat rooftops of the city. Men rise and wash and pray. In the houses around the mosque, students are already awake, reviewing the texts they studied the evening before. A scholar prepares for the day's teaching, settling into the room where his students will gather, arranging the manuscripts he will use. The market opens. The merchants of Timbuktu are a cosmopolitan crowd. There are Mande traders from the south with gold and kola nuts. There are Tuareg merchants from the desert with salt and dates and news from the north. There are Moroccan traders with goods from across the Mediterranean world. There are Songhai people, the dominant ethnic group of the empire that now controls the city, moving through the stalls with the comfortable authority of the locally powerful. The streets smell of dust and animals and the particular sweetness of the acacia trees that grow near the edges of the city. Children run between the houses. Women carry clay pots of water from the wells. Somewhere, a craftsman is working leather, the smell of the tanning process drifting through the narrow lanes. And in dozens of houses and shops and corners, people are reading. People are arguing about texts. People are copying manuscripts by hand, the slow, laborious, essential work of preserving knowledge before the age of printing. A scholar dictates to a student. A merchant shows a contract to a legal expert. A judge reads from a law book, while two men argue their case in front of him. This is Timbuktu, not a myth, not a punchline, a city, a breathing, working, thinking, arguing, praying, trading, living city, as real and as complex as any city that has ever existed on Earth. But Timbuktu did not exist in isolation, and its political fate was never entirely in its own hands. The empire that controlled it during its greatest period was the Songhai Empire, and to understand what happened to Timbuktu, we need to understand the rise and fall of Songhai. The Songhai people had lived along the Niger for centuries, settled around a place called Gao, several hundred miles downstream from Timbuktu. They had been part of the Mali Empire, subject to it, and then, as Mali weakened in the 14th and 15th centuries, they had grown more independent, more powerful, more ambitious. The man who transformed Songhai from a local power to a great empire was Sunni Ali, who came to the throne in 1464. He was a military genius and a political animal, a ruler of extraordinary energy and ruthlessness. He spent almost his entire reign on campaign, expanding his territory in every direction, absorbing the remains of Mali, pushing north and east and west until he controlled a state larger than Western Europe. He took Timbuktu in 1468. The city did not welcome him. The scholars and merchants of Timbuktu had complex relationships with the rulers who passed through, and Sunni Ali represented a particular problem. He was Muslim, formally, but his practice of Islam was mixed with older indigenous religious traditions in a way that the Orthodox scholars found offensive, even heretical. He reportedly prayed, but also made sacrifices to non-Islamic spirits. He had power relationships with religious practitioners the scholars considered pagan. More practically, his armies were not gentle with the city. There were killings, there was property destroyed. The scholars who had been so central to Timbuktu's identity wrote about Sunni Ali with barely concealed horror, describing him as a tyrant and a persecutor of the learned. Some of this was genuine grievance, and some of it was the exaggeration of men who had been on the losing side of a political transition, but the disruption was real. Then Sunni Ali died in 1492, drowned while crossing a river in circumstances that remain murky. His son succeeded him briefly, but within months there was a coup. A Muslim general named Muhammad Touré, known as Askia Muhammad, deposed the son and took power. Askia Muhammad was everything Sunni Ali was not, in terms of the scholars' preferences. He was a deeply committed Muslim. He made his own pilgrimage to Mecca. He brought back knowledge and legitimacy from the Islamic heartland. He patronized learning. He built. He codified laws. He built a more complex administrative structure for the empire. Under Askia Muhammad, Timbuktu entered what is often called its true golden age. The scholar Ahmad Baba would later look back on this period as a time of extraordinary intellectual flourishing. Manuscripts were produced at an accelerating rate. The university at Sankore reached its peak of influence. Scholars came from across the Islamic world to learn in Timbuktu, and Timbuktu scholars were invited to the courts of distant kings and the councils of distant caliphs. Timbuktu, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, was a city that understood itself as a major player in world civilization, not a provincial outpost, not a remote curiosity, a center. The question of how such a center falls is always a complex one. There is never a single cause. There is never a simple villain. History does not work that way, and Timbuktu's decline is a lesson in how multiple pressures, applied from different directions over different timescales, can hollow out even the most robust civilization. The first blow came from an unexpected direction: the sea. Portugal had been, throughout the 15th century, extending its sailing technology and its navigational knowledge down the coast of Africa. The Portuguese were looking for a route to the spice trade of Asia that did not require crossing the Muslim-controlled land routes of the Middle East. They were also looking for the source of the gold that had been flowing north across the Sahara for centuries. They had heard about it. They wanted to find it. In 1488, Bartolomé Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama completed the route to India. Suddenly, there was a sea route from Europe to Asia that bypassed the great Saharan trade networks entirely. This is often presented as a technological triumph, a story of European ingenuity, and in terms of navigation, it was. But for Timbuktu and for the entire system of trans-Saharan trade, it was a catastrophe in slow motion. The trade did not stop immediately. It could not. The caravan routes were ancient and embedded. The relationships between traders were generations deep. The infrastructure of wells and waypoints and market cities had been built over centuries and could not simply be abandoned overnight. The goods that moved north across the desert, gold and slaves and ivory, continued to move north. But the route was now in competition with the sea, and the sea route won, not in a decade, not even in a generation, but over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, the trans-Saharan trade shrank. The gold of West Africa increasingly moved out through the Atlantic ports, captured by the Portuguese, and then the Dutch, and then the English, and then the French, flowing into a new global economy that had no particular interest in the caravan cities of the interior. The tax revenues that the Songhai Empire and the city of Timbuktu depended on began to dry up. The merchants who had sustained the scholars began to look toward the coast. The intellectual life of the city was not immediately affected, because knowledge is more resilient than commerce and can sustain itself on less. But the economic foundation was weakening, and then came the second blow. This one was sudden and violent. In 1591, a Moroccan army crossed the Sahara. This was remarkable in itself. No one had ever attempted a military crossing of the Sahara Desert with a modern, professional army. The desert was considered impassable for that kind of force. It was too hot, too dry, too vast. The distances between water sources were too great, the terrain too brutal. The Moroccan Sultan, Ahmad al-Mansur, thought differently. He had reasons to want what was on the other side of the desert. He had heard the old stories of West African gold, the same stories that had been circulating in the Islamic world for centuries. He knew that the Songhai Empire was weakening, that succession disputes had fractured its political structure, that a foreign army might find easier resistance than expected. And he had something new. He had guns. The Songhai army was large and experienced and had fought many battles, but it was equipped with traditional weapons: spears, arrows, cavalry. The Moroccan army that crossed the desert under a commander named Judar Pasha brought firearms, muskets and cannon, weapons that the Songhai had never faced in battle. At the Battle of Tondibi in 1591, the Songhai cavalry charged the Moroccan lines. The guns fired. The noise alone, which neither the Songhai soldiers nor their cattle had ever heard, caused the cattle that had been driven ahead as a defensive measure to stampede back through the Songhai lines. Then the musket fire hit the cavalry. The battle was over remarkably quickly. An army that had dominated the region for a century was broken in an afternoon. The Songhai Empire collapsed, and the Moroccan army marched to Timbuktu. What happened next is described in the manuscripts of the city itself, particularly in a document called the Tariq al-Sudan, the history of the Sudan, meaning the land south of the Sahara, not the modern country, written by a scholar named Abd al-Rahman al-Sadi, who witnessed or carefully recorded the events of these decades. The Moroccan soldiers entered Timbuktu. They looted, they killed some residents, they burned some buildings, they imposed new taxes. And most devastatingly, they began arresting scholars. The scholars of Timbuktu had, in the weeks before the Moroccan arrival, written letters back and forth debating whether to flee or to stay, whether resistance was possible or wise, what their religious obligations were in the face of a conquering army. Many stayed, trusting that their status as scholars, their religious authority, would protect them. It did not. In 1593, the Moroccan governor of Timbuktu ordered the arrest and exile of the leading scholars of the city. Dozens were taken. Ahmad Baba was among them. They were marched across the Sahara, in chains, to Marrakesh. Several died on the journey. The survivors were held in Morocco for many years. Ahmad Baba reportedly refused to cooperate with his captors. He refused to flatter them. He refused to use the connections he had to make his captivity comfortable. He was, by the accounts that survive, a man of extraordinary dignity in conditions designed to humiliate him. He continued to teach and to write in captivity, because that was what he was and that was what he did. He eventually returned to Timbuktu, old and diminished, long after the worst of the chaos had subsided. But the exile of the scholars was not merely a human tragedy, it was a structural catastrophe. The scholars were the living memory of the city's intellectual tradition. They were the ones who knew where the manuscripts were, how to interpret them, which ones were authoritative and which were derivative. They were the ones who attracted students and who could attract more. When they were taken away, the university at Sankore effectively ceased to function. Students had no teachers, teachers had no students. The manuscripts sat in their houses and their libraries and their sealed rooms. Many were hidden deliberately, tucked behind false walls, or buried beneath floors, or carried out of the city by servants and students who fled south into the savannah and the forest, away from the Moroccan soldiers. Some were simply lost to time, to the slow destruction of heat and insects, and neglect and the occasional fire. The Moroccan occupation lasted about a century, though it weakened rapidly after the first generation. The Pashas, as the Moroccan governors were called, became increasingly independent of Morocco, increasingly integrated into the local politics of the region. They intermarried with Songhai and Mande women. They became something new, a mixed ruling class called the Arma, neither truly Moroccan nor truly Songhai, but they could not restore what had been lost. The economic foundations of Timbuktu's greatness were eroding as the trans-Saharan trade continued to weaken. The intellectual foundations had been shattered by the exile and death of the scholars and never fully recovered. The political foundations were fractured, contested, in constant low-level conflict. And then came something else. Something that no army and no exile and no economic shift could have prepared the city for. The desert came closer. Climate is not neutral in human history. It shapes civilizations in ways that are easy to overlook because they operate on timescales longer than any individual life. The Sahara had been slowly expanding southward for millennia, but the rate of that expansion was not constant. There were periods of wetter conditions, during which the desert's edge retreated a little, and periods of drier conditions, during which it advanced. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the Sahel experienced a prolonged drought. The rains that had been relatively reliable became unreliable. The Niger's annual floods, the great gift that made agriculture possible along its banks, became erratic, sometimes failing to reach the height that filled the inland delta and spread the life-giving silt across the floodplain. Crops failed, animals died. The pastoral people of the desert, the Tuareg and the Fulani and others, who had already been dealing with the disruptions caused by the political upheaval, found their traditional grazing grounds shrinking. They pressed south and east and west, competing with settled farmers for the diminishing resources. Violence followed, raiding, competition for wells, control of the few routes that remained reliably supplied with water. The landscape that had once supported the great caravan trade became increasingly lawless and dangerous. For Timbuktu, which had always depended on the security of the trade routes for its prosperity, this was another layer of catastrophe. Merchants who could not be guaranteed safe passage did not come, and merchants who did not come did not bring gold or goods or books, or students, the population of Timbuktu declined. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. The great university at Sankore became a shadow of what it had been. The mosques continued their services because the religious life of the city was more resilient than its economy or its scholarship. But even the mosques required maintenance, and mud brick mosques, in a desert climate, require constant attention, and that attention requires resources. Some of the great houses were abandoned. Their owners had moved away, south or north, following whatever economic opportunities remained. The rooms that had held libraries, that had smelled of ink and old paper and the particular mustiness of manuscripts, were sealed. Sometimes by people who intended to return, sometimes simply left because there was no one left to decide what to do with them. The city contracted. It pulled inward. It became smaller and quieter and less certain of itself than it had been in the days when scholars debated the circumference of the earth and kings returned from Mecca with architects in tow. And in Europe and the Americas, the stories about Timbuktu changed. The tales that had filtered through over the centuries, the stories of a city of gold and learning, persisted, but they became increasingly untethered from reality. No one from the European world had actually been to Timbuktu and returned to tell the story. The city was inaccessible by the sea routes that now dominated European commerce. It was deep in the interior, in a region controlled by people who had excellent reasons to be suspicious of European visitors, given what the Europeans had been doing to the coast of Africa for 2 centuries. Slave trading, raiding, colonizing. So the stories became legends, and the legends became myths, and Timbuktu became, in the European imagination, a city that was too perfect to be real, too golden to be believed, too distant to be verified. The scholars who had actually lived there, who had written the histories and the legal texts and the astronomical calculations, were unknown in Europe. The manuscripts that survived were sealed in rooms that European scholars had never seen. The history of West African civilization was, from the European perspective, effectively invisible. This invisibility was not accidental. It was the product of choices, of the decision to route the new global economy through the Atlantic coast rather than the Saharan interior, of the slave trade that was transforming the political and social structures of West Africa in ways that made scholarship and city building increasingly difficult, of the colonial ideology that required African civilizations to be seen as primitive and undeveloped in order to justify their conquest and exploitation. Timbuktu, the Golden City, disappeared into the gap between what was real and what Europe chose to see. By the early 19th century, the legend of Timbuktu had become something of an obsession in Europe. Specifically, it had become an obsession in Britain. The British, who were extending their commercial and colonial reach across West Africa through the coastal forts and the tentative inland expeditions of the period, were fascinated by the rumours of a great city in the interior. The African Association, a London organisation dedicated to geographical exploration, offered prizes for information about the Niger River and the cities along its banks. Explorer after explorer set out for the interior of West Africa. Most never returned. The combination of the heat, the distance, the unfamiliar diseases, and the justified suspicion of the local populations made these expeditions extraordinarily dangerous. Men died of malaria and dysentery. They were turned back by hostile rulers. They disappeared into the desert and were never heard from again. The city acquired a reputation not only for its legendary wealth, but for its lethality to European visitors. The story went that no white man had ever reached Timbuktu and returned alive. This was not quite true, but it was close enough to the truth to be terrifying, and it made the city into something like a challenge, a test of endurance and courage, and the peculiarly European obsession with getting to places that did not want them. In 1824, the Paris Geographical Society offered a prize of 10,000 francs to the first Frenchman to reach Timbuktu and return with a reliable account of it. This was a significant sum, and it attracted the attention of a young Frenchman named René Caillié. Caillié was not a wealthy man, not an aristocrat with connections and resources. He was the son of a baker, He had been fascinated by Africa since childhood, since reading Robinson Crusoe and imagining himself in unknown lands. He had attempted to reach Timbuktu once before and failed. He spent years learning Arabic, studying Islam, preparing himself for a journey that he planned to make in disguise, traveling as a Muslim pilgrim rather than a European explorer. In 1827, he set out from the coast of what is now Guinea. He traveled for over a year, much of it on foot, through some of the most difficult terrain in West Africa, often sick, often uncertain of his direction, often at the mercy of the hospitality of strangers. He spent months waiting for caravans to organize themselves, for the right season for his health to recover enough to continue. He reached Timbuktu on the 20th of April, 1828. He was not impressed. His account, published in France and translated across Europe, was one of the great, deflating documents in the history of exploration. He described a city of about 10 or 12,000 people, most of its buildings made of mud brick, its streets unpaved and sandy. It was, he wrote, neither as large nor as wealthy as the legends had suggested. The famous mosques were there, impressive in their way, but there was nothing made of gold. The streets were not paved with it. There were no jewels set into the walls of the houses. What he found was a real city, a functioning, inhabited, living place. But it was not the myth. It was diminished. It was a city that had been through several centuries of decline, of violence, of neglect, of the slow withdrawal of the resources that had once made it great. It was still Timbuktu, but it was a Timbuktu that had aged badly, that had lost much of what had made it remarkable, that was surviving rather than thriving. Kellier returned to France with his account and collected his prize. He was celebrated briefly, then largely forgotten. His story was, in some ways, too honest to be satisfying. People did not want a real Timbuktu, they wanted the legend. And the legend required a city that was still, somehow, glittering. The account of a dusty, half-empty town in the Sahara did not feed that hunger. A British explorer named Alexander Gordon Laing had actually reached Timbuktu 2 years before Kellier, in 1826, making him the first European confirmed to have arrived there. But Laing was murdered shortly after leaving the city, and his notes were lost or destroyed, so his account did not survive to reshape the European understanding of the place. Timbuktu remained, in the popular imagination, more legend than reality. The 19th century brought new disruptions to Timbuktu's already troubled existence. The Fulani people, pastoralists, and scholars who had converted to Islam and built their own reform movements, established a new political structure across the Western Sudan. A Fulani jihadist named Usman Dan Fodio had, in the early 1800s, created the Sokoto Caliphate to the east of Timbuktu, a state that combined military power with Islamic scholarship and administration in ways that echoed, distantly, the glories of Songhai. His movement's influence rippled across the region, inspiring similar reform movements and sometimes violent conflicts between different interpretations of Islamic practice. Timbuktu was caught in the crosscurrents. Different groups competed for control of the city and its surrounding territory. The Tuareg, the Fulani, the various successor states of the old Moroccan Armor rulers all had claims and interests. The city changed hands multiple times, usually not through dramatic battles, but through the slower, more grinding process of one group establishing dominance and then losing it to another. A particularly significant takeover came in 1826, when a Fulani state established control. Then, in 1863, Timbuktu was seized by an extraordinary conqueror named El Hajj Umar Tall, a Senegalese Sufi scholar and military leader who had built a vast empire through a combination of military conquest and religious authority. His forces swept through the Western Sudan, defeating rival states, absorbing populations, carrying the banner of a particular interpretation of Islamic reform. Umar Tall's empire was, in its way, impressive, but it was an empire built through violence, and the communities it absorbed were not always grateful. Timbuktu in particular, with its tradition of Maliki Islamic jurisprudence and its identity as a city of scholars rather than warriors, did not fit easily into the Tijaniya Sufi order that Umar Tall promoted. And Umar Tool did not live long to consolidate his conquests. He died in 1864, in circumstances that remain somewhat obscure, and his empire began to fragment under his successors. Into this fragmentation came the French. France had been building its West African empire from the coast, pressing inland through the river networks and the military campaigns that became the pattern of late 19th century colonial expansion. By the 1880s, the French military presence along the upper Niger was substantial and growing. They were encountering resistance everywhere, from the various local powers that had carved up the Western Sudan among themselves. But the French had the guns, as the Moroccans had once had the guns, and guns had a way of resolving political questions in favor of whoever held them. On the 28th of December, 1893, a French column under Lieutenant Gaston Bonnier marched into Timbuktu. The occupation was not without bloodshed. Bonnier himself was killed shortly after, ambushed by Tuareg fighters who had decided that the French represented an intolerable imposition. His successor continued the campaign. The Tuareg, who had been raiding and controlling access to Timbuktu for generations, were brought under French authority through a combination of military force and treaty. The city became part of French West Africa, the vast colonial territory that the French were assembling across the continent. For Timbuktu, French colonial rule was another layer of disruption over a city that had already endured so many. The French administration brought certain things: roads, eventually, and later a telegraph line, and a colonial school system that taught French and French values to the children of local elites. They mapped the territory and built forts and established the administrative structures that colonial powers built everywhere they went. But they also imposed French political authority over a city that had spent centuries organizing itself around Islamic scholarship and Muslim legal traditions. The scholars of Timbuktu, those who remained, and those who inherited the tradition of the great libraries, found themselves marginalized in a new way. Their knowledge, their legal authority, their social status, all of it was irrelevant to the French administration, which operated according to entirely different principles and had no interest in the manuscripts piled in the houses of the old families. There was one French officer who was different. Félix Dubois, who arrived in Timbuktu in 1894, was genuinely interested in the city's history. He wrote a book about it, Timbuktu the Mysterious, published in 1897, which attempted to convey the actual history of the city rather than simply the European myth. It was well received and did something to shift the European understanding of Timbuktu from pure legend towards something more grounded in reality. But Dubois was an exception, and his influence was limited. The French colonial period lasted until 1960, when Mali became an independent country. For those 67 years, Timbuktu was a provincial outpost in a colonial empire. Its famous mosques, maintained by their traditional custodians, but not celebrated or supported by the colonial administration, its manuscripts largely invisible to the outside world. After independence, the new Malian government inherited a Timbuktu that was still struggling with all the problems that had accumulated over centuries: the economic weakness, the encroachment of the desert, the impoverishment of the scholarly tradition. Independence did not reverse these trends. The global economic system that had crystallized during the colonial era continued to marginalize the interior of West Africa in favor of the coastal trading cities that were better connected to international commerce. Timbuktu remained poor, remained remote, remained, in the popular imagination outside Africa, a joke about distance, but the manuscripts survived. This is the astonishing thing. Through all of it, through the Moroccan invasion and the exile of the scholars and the looting of the city, through the centuries of drought and economic decline and political fragmentation, through the French colonial period and its indifference to indigenous intellectual traditions, through the poverty and the isolation of the post-colonial era, the manuscripts survived. They survived because people protected them. Families who had been custodians of manuscript collections for generations continued to be custodians, even when they could not fully read what they were keeping, even when the knowledge encoded in the old Arabic script had become partially inaccessible, even when the practical day-to-day value of the manuscripts was zero. They kept them because they understood, intuitively and culturally, that these books represented something important. that the old men and women of the family had always treated them with reverence, that there was a dignity in being the keeper of things that had been kept for centuries, that these manuscripts were, in some sense, the proof of what Timbuktu had been. The physical evidence against the myth that there was nothing there, that there had never been anything there, that the city was always just a punchline. The manuscript collections sat in sealed rooms and wrapped bundles and buried containers. Some were damaged by insects, some were damaged by water, some were damaged by simple age, the paper or vellum slowly disintegrating, the ink fading, but a remarkable number survived in condition good enough to be read, analyzed, and digitized when the modern world finally turned its attention to them. In the 1990s and 2000s, scholars began to take seriously the scale of what survived in Timbuktu. The Malian government, international organizations, and scholars from around the world collaborated on projects to catalogue, preserve, and digitize the manuscripts. The Mama Haidara Commemorative Library, named after a major collector and custodian, became a center for this work. The Ahmed Baba Institute, named after the great scholar of the 16th and 17th centuries, was established to provide a modern institutional home for the preservation of this heritage. The numbers that emerged were staggering. Not tens of thousands of manuscripts, not hundreds of thousands. Potentially, according to some estimates, more than 1 million. Even the more conservative estimates, which put the surviving total at around 300,000, represented an intellectual heritage of breathtaking scope. This was not a small collection of curiosities. This was one of the great concentrations of medieval scholarship anywhere in the world, comparable to the manuscript traditions of European monasteries or the great libraries of the Islamic East. The world began to pay attention. Timbuktu began to appear not only as a punchline, but as a story about what Africa had been and what had been done to it, and what had survived in spite of everything. And then, in 2012, everything almost went wrong again. The Arab Spring that swept through North Africa in 2011 had destabilizing effects that reached far beyond the countries where it began. In Libya, the fall of Muammar Gaddafi released enormous quantities of weapons into the region and displaced armed groups that had been integrated into his security structure. Among these were Tuareg fighters who had served in the Libyan army and who now returned to Mali with weapons and training and grievances of their own. In early 2012, Tuareg separatist fighters, some of them allied with jihadist groups, swept through northern Mali. The Malian army collapsed. Town after town in the north fell. Timbuktu fell, in March 2012, to a coalition of Tuareg separatists and jihadist fighters who rapidly turned into a controlling force dominated by the hardline Islamist groups, particularly Ansar Dine and later MSNBC and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. The people of Timbuktu found themselves under a rule that banned music, destroyed shrines, imposed harsh punishments for infractions of their interpretation of Islamic law, and set about systematically destroying what they considered idolatrous structures. The old mausoleums and shrines of Timbuktu's saints, which had been UNESCO World Heritage Sites, were torn down by men with pickaxes. The ancient tombs that had been tended by families for centuries were reduced to rubble, and there were threats against the manuscripts. The extremists who now controlled the city viewed the manuscripts with suspicion. Some of them, the legal texts and Quranic commentaries, they found acceptable. Others, the astronomical texts, the philosophical texts, the texts that engaged with non-Islamic knowledge traditions, they considered heretical or, at minimum, suspicious. There were statements suggesting that some manuscripts might be destroyed. What happened next was extraordinary. A network of Timbuktu's families and custodians, working quietly and at great personal risk, began moving manuscripts out of the city. They wrapped them in cloth and plastic and hid them in rice sacks and transported them south in donkey carts and in canoes along the Niger and in cars taking farm produce to market. They moved hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, one collection at a time, over the course of months, to safer locations in Bamako, the Malian capital, and elsewhere. One man, a manuscript custodian and dealer, named Abdel Kader Haidara, is credited with organizing much of this effort. He worked with an international network of contacts and organizations, raising money to fund the smuggling operation, coordinating the logistics, protecting the most important collections. He risked imprisonment, and worse, in a city controlled by people who would not have approved of what he was doing. When the French military intervened in January 2013, driving the jihadist forces out of the north and retaking Timbuktu, most of the manuscripts were already gone. They had been saved. Not all of them. Some were destroyed, burned by the retreating extremists, along with computers and archives in the Ahmed Baba Institute. But the great majority, the hundreds of thousands of pages that held the history of Timbuktu's intellectual life, had been moved to safety. The story of the manuscript rescue became itself a remarkable document, a testament to what people will do to protect the things that matter to them, a testament to the persistent understanding among the families of Timbuktu that the manuscripts were not just objects but a living inheritance, a responsibility passed down through generations, something worth risking your life to protect. After the French intervention and the eventual establishment of UN peacekeeping forces in northern Mali, Timbuktu was slowly rebuilt and reconnected to the rest of the country. The extremists were gone, though not destroyed, and the security situation remained fragile. The mausoleums that had been destroyed were rebuilt with international support, a remarkable and meaningful act of cultural restoration. The manuscripts were gradually returned. They came back to a city that was trying, once again, to be more than it had been during those 10 dark months of occupation. Timbuktu today is a city of about 30,000 people, a fraction of what it once was, and it carries its history the way all ancient places carry history, imperfectly, incompletely, in the stones of its mosques, and the sealed rooms of its old houses, and the faces of people who know they live somewhere that the world once cared about. The three great mosques still stand: Jingareba, Sankor, Sidi Yahya. They have been rebuilt so many times over the centuries that no part of their physical structure dates to the original construction, but the form persists. The relationship between the building and the city persists. The prayers that have been said inside their walls for centuries continue to be said. They are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and they receive visitors, not many by global tourism standards, because Timbuktu is genuinely difficult to reach, and the security situation in northern Mali remains concerning. But the manuscripts are being digitized, slowly and with inadequate funding by teams of scholars from Mali and around the world. The images are being shared online, made accessible to researchers who could never travel to Timbuktu, translated from Arabic into languages that more people read. The contents of these manuscripts are gradually becoming part of the global scholarly conversation in ways they have not been for centuries. What they reveal continues to surprise. A manuscript that discusses the ethics of slavery in terms that anticipate later abolitionist arguments. A medical text that describes symptoms with a clinical precision that would not have been out of place in a European university of the same period. An astronomical calculation that is, by modern standards, remarkably accurate. A history of the Songhai Empire that provides a perspective on these events that no European source could offer because it was written by someone who was there. These manuscripts are not just historical curiosities. They are a corrective. They are evidence that the story of human civilization is not the story that the colonial era told about it. Not the story in which Europe was always the center and Africa was always the periphery. Not the story in which knowledge and sophistication were exclusively Western possessions, and everywhere else was waiting to be civilized. They are evidence of a different story, a more complicated, more interesting, more accurate story. They are evidence that in the 15th century, while Leonardo da Vinci was painting in Florence and Columbus was crossing the Atlantic, there was a city called Timbuktu, where 25,000 students were studying mathematics and astronomy and medicine in universities that predate some of the oldest European universities by centuries, where manuscripts were produced and collected and debated with a seriousness and depth that matched anything happening in the intellectual centers of Europe or the Middle East. That this city is now a punchline is not an accident. It is the product of decisions made by powerful people over centuries. Decisions about which trade routes to use and which to abandon. Decisions about which civilizations to study and which to ignore. decisions about how to organize the global economy, and who would benefit from that organization and who would not. Timbuktu did not disappear because it was never real. It disappeared from view because it was inconvenient for certain people's understanding of the world to acknowledge that it was real. The manuscripts are making it real again. There is a quality to the light in Timbuktu that people who have been there often describe. A particular quality of the desert light in the late afternoon, when the sun is low and the sand reflects it back in a way that makes the old mud brick buildings glow, that makes even a diminished and dusty city seem, briefly, luminous. A golden quality, not the gold of coins and commerce, though that was real too, but the gold of light on old walls, of late sun on ancient stone, of a city that has endured so much and is still, somehow, standing. The griots of Mali, the professional storytellers and historians, have a concept that translates roughly as the weight of history. The idea that some places and some stories carry more weight than others, that they press down on the present with a kind of insistence, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be told. Timbuktu carries that weight. It carries the weight of everything that happened there, and everything that was done to it, and everything that was taken from it, and everything that was preserved in spite of everything. It carries the weight of 25,000 students in a university that no one in Europe knew existed, of manuscripts that survived a Moroccan invasion and 2 centuries of colonial neglect, and 10 months of jihadist occupation because people carried them in rice sacks and canoes, of a scholar named Ahmad Baba who wrote 40 books and was marched in chains across the Sahara and came home and kept writing. It carries the weight of all the things the world said it was not, and all the things it was anyway. There is one more thing to say before we let the night have its way with us, before we let the quiet settle in and the story find its natural resting place. The people who live in Timbuktu today are not museum pieces. They are not tragic remnants of a lost civilization, though they carry that loss with them. They are people who wake in the morning and pray, and cook, and argue, and trade, and raise children, and tend mosques and hide manuscripts, and give directions to the occasional confused tourist, and worry about the security situation, and hope for rain. They are, in other words, the same as they have always been, the same as the Oscan farmers who built their 5 villages on the plateau above the Sano River. If you'll forgive the comparison to another fallen city from another story, the same as the scholars who debated jurisprudence in the house of Sankor and the merchants who weighed salt against gold in the markets of the Niger Bend. Human beings in a place that has a past, trying to live in a present, hoping, maybe, for a future that is better than the recent past has been. The manuscripts are coming back to Timbuktu. Slowly, in carefully controlled conditions, as the infrastructure is rebuilt and the security situation, cautiously and imperfectly, stabilizes. They are coming back to the city that made them and lost them and tried to protect them and nearly lost them again. They are coming back because someone decided centuries ago that knowledge was worth keeping, and someone else decided 50 years ago that the knowledge of others was worth cataloguing, and someone else decided 10 years ago that a collection of books was worth risking their life for. They are coming back because there are still people who understand, intuitively and profoundly, that a city is more than its buildings, and more than its commerce, and more than its political structures. That a city is, at its deepest level, the things it thought, and the things it wrote down, and the things it chose to remember and carry forward across the centuries. Timbuktu thought extraordinary things. It wrote them down, it carried them forward, and it is still there, at the top of the bend in the Niger, in the golden light of the late afternoon, waiting for the world to catch up with what it has always known. The desert at night is extraordinary. The stars over Timbuktu are spectacular in a way that people who live with urban light pollution have lost the ability to fully imagine. There is no glow on the horizon from a distant city. There are no streetlights to speak of. There is the dark, and then there are the stars, thousands of them, more than you can count, arranged in patterns that the scholars of Sankor once used to calculate latitude and track the seasons and navigate the endless Sahara. The students who slept in the houses around Sankore Mosque 1500 years ago would have looked up at these same stars. The scholars who debated the circumference of the earth would have used these stars as their reference points. The merchants who arrived after months in the desert would have navigated by these stars to find this specific place, this camp at the top of the bend, this place where the routes converged. The stars have not changed. They are not sentimental about what has happened below them. They do not mourn the lost libraries, or the exiled scholars, or the burned manuscripts. They simply continue to be there, providing the same navigational certainty they have always provided to whoever has the knowledge to read them and the patience to look. There is something settling about that, about the idea that the sky over Timbuktu is the same sky that was there when the city was great, and that it will be there long after everything built below it has returned to sand. That the stars that guided the caravans toward this place are the same stars that hung over the sleeping scholars, the same stars that the Moroccan soldiers saw when they arrived with their guns, the same stars that illuminate the manuscripts being carefully unwrapped and photographed by the scholars working to preserve them. The story of Timbuktu is, in one reading, a story about impermanence, about how even the most magnificent things can be diminished, can be reduced, can be buried in the sand and forgotten, about how the things we build to last do not always last, and the things we build to endure can crumble. But there is another reading. It is a story about persistence, about how things that seem lost can be found, about how knowledge, once written down and carefully kept, can survive across centuries and empires and wars and droughts and conquests and neglect, about how the people who keep things, who tend the old books and maintain the old mosques and pass down the old stories, are doing something profound and important even when no one is watching and no one is celebrating and the world has moved on and the city is just a punchline. The manuscripts of Timbuktu waited. They waited in sealed rooms and rice sacks and the holds of canoes moving down the Niger towards safety. They waited through everything, and now they are being read again, being translated, being understood, being incorporated into a larger understanding of what human civilization has been and what it has known and what it has produced. They waited because someone kept them. That is the story of Timbuktu. Not the punchline, not the joke about distance, not the myth of the golden city with jewels in the walls. The real story. The story of a place that was real and magnificent and wounded and diminished and still standing and still fighting in its quiet way to be known for what it was. Let the silence come in now. Let the images settle. The caravans crossing the Sahara in the early morning when the air is briefly cool. The salt slabs loaded on camels, glittering white against the dun-coloured sand. The markets of Timbuktu in the 15th century, loud with a dozen languages and the smells of spices and animals and the river. The mosque at Sankor, its distinctive mud brick walls and wooden beams, the muezzin's call floating across the low rooftops at dawn. The scholars in their houses, bent over manuscripts by the light of oil lamps, writing and arguing and thinking. Ahmad Baba in chains, crossing the desert, holding his dignity as if it were the most important manuscript in his library. The families wrapping books in cloth and loading them into canoes, moving them south through the night, away from the armed men who did not understand what they were protecting. The manuscripts arriving in Bamako, safe, damaged but mostly intact, carrying in their pages the weight of 6 centuries of human thought. And Timbuktu itself, right now, in whatever night it is experiencing there on the southern edge of the Sahara, the mosques lit from within during the evening prayers, the narrow streets quiet, the old houses standing as they have stood in various forms for centuries, the stars overhead, indifferent and spectacular, a real place, a real history, a real story. The golden city everyone thinks is a myth, still there, still waiting, still in its quiet and diminished and extraordinary way, absolutely real. Sleep well, and carry this with you, somewhere beneath the noise of things. The knowledge that the world is stranger and older and more interesting than the punchlines suggest. That somewhere on the edge of the Sahara, in a city whose name people use to mean the end of the world, there are manuscripts that prove the world is very much larger than we sometimes remember, and that the people who kept those manuscripts, who carried them to safety, who are even now working to read and share and preserve them, are doing something that the scholars of Timbuktu would have recognized and honored. Knowledge kept, passed forward, alive. That is enough. That has always been enough. Good night. But the story is not done. A story this old never ends cleanly. It continues in the morning. It continues in the people. It continues in the places the eye cannot quite find on a map, because they have been named and renamed and buried and rebuilt too many times for any single name to stick. Let us go back further. Let us not be satisfied with the official beginning of Timbuktu's story. Let us go back to the world, that made the city possible. Because nothing springs from nothing, and the roots of the thing we are describing go deeper than the 11th century, deeper than the Niger River's seasonal floods, deeper than any particular group of people who happen to stop at a particular spot on a particular plain. Let us go back to the Sahara when it was green. 12,000 years ago, the land we now call the Sahara was not a desert. This fact does more to reshape our understanding of African history than almost anything else, because the desert is so psychologically total, so overwhelming in its current form, that it seems to have always been this way. It seems like geology, like something that was there before human time began. But 12,000 years ago, during a period that paleoclimatologists call the African Humid Period, or the Green Sahara, rainfall patterns across North Africa were radically different. The monsoon rains that now reach only as far north as the Sahel penetrated deep into the continent. The Sahara was dotted with lakes and crisscrossed with rivers. It supported grasslands and savannas and forests in certain areas. It was full of animals, hippos and crocodiles in the lakes, elephants and giraffes on the plains, fish in the rivers, and people. People everywhere. The rock art of the Sahara, found in the Tassili Najjar Plateau in what is now Algeria, in the Fezzan region of Libya, in the Tibesti Mountains of Chad and Niger, tells this story in painted and engraved images. There are images of cattle herders tending enormous herds, of hunters pursuing game across grasslands, of fishermen with nets and canoes, of people swimming in what is now the driest, hottest place on earth. These people were sophisticated. They had complex material culture. They decorated their bodies and their pottery. They developed and maintained relationships with the animals they herded. They traded across distances. They accumulated knowledge about plants and animals and seasons and water sources that was essential for survival in a landscape that was bountiful but also unpredictable. Around 6,000 years ago, the rains began to retreat. It happened gradually, over centuries, not overnight. But it happened. The lakes dried, the rivers shrank, the grasslands died back. The animals that had depended on the grasslands moved south, following the retreating moisture, and the people followed them, or adapted, or did both. This is one of the great human migrations of prehistory. We don't have names for the people who made it. We don't have written records, but we have their bones in the sediment of old lake beds, their tools scattered on plains that are now pure sand, their images on rocks that stand in landscapes utterly unlike what the images depict. Some of them moved south and became the ancestors of the various West African peoples who would eventually build the empires and the cities we have been discussing. Others stayed in the increasingly arid north and became the ancestors of the Tuareg and the Berber peoples of the Sahara, developing the extraordinary adaptation strategies that allowed human beings to live in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Their knowledge of the desert, accumulated over millennia of living in and with it, was what made the trans-Saharan trade possible. When Arab merchants from the north began seeking routes across the desert in the 7th and 8th centuries, they were using paths and waterholes and seasonal stopping points that had been known to the desert peoples for thousands of years. They were inserting themselves into a network that already existed. This is important. The trans-Saharan trade is often told as a story about Arab commercial expansion, as if the North African and Arab merchants who organized the camel caravans invented the routes they traveled. They did not. They inherited them. They formalized and expanded and commercialized a movement of people and goods across the desert that predated their arrival by millennia. The desert people, the Tuareg in particular, were not merely passive conduits for this trade. They were its masters. They knew where the water was. They knew which routes were passable in which seasons. They knew the difference between a safe shortcut and a deadly one. Without their knowledge and their cooperation, no caravan from North Africa would ever have reached the Niger Bend. The merchants from the north needed the desert people to survive the desert, and the price of that knowledge and those services was extracted in tolls and fees and shares of the goods that moved along the routes. The Tuareg were, in other words, the original infrastructure of the trans-Saharan trade. And when we understand this, we understand that Timbuktu's location at the top of the Niger Bend was not simply a geographic accident. It was the point where the Tuareg's desert knowledge met the Niger Valley's water and fertility, where the infrastructure of the desert met the infrastructure of the river. That intersection was where the wealth flowed, and where the wealth flowed, a city grew. Let us also spend some time with the gold, because the gold is important, not just as a trade good, not just as the engine of economic wealth, but as a phenomenon, as something that the land of West Africa produced in quantities that the outside world could barely believe, and that shaped the destiny of the region in ways that are still felt today. The gold of West Africa came from several sources. There were placer deposits along certain rivers, places where the metal could be panned from the riverbed in much the same way as the California gold rush prospectors would pan rivers 10 centuries later. There were deeper deposits that required mining, digging into the earth, following veins of ore-bearing rock, and there were alluvial deposits in certain landscapes where the gold had been concentrated by geological processes over millions of years. The three great goldfields of West Africa in the medieval period were Bambouk in what is now eastern Senegal, Bure in what is now Western Guinea, and Akan in what is now Ghana. Each of these areas had been producing gold for centuries before the Arab traders arrived, and the local peoples who controlled access to these goldfields were sophisticated about protecting that control. This is something that tends to get lost in the standard narratives of West African history. The picture that sometimes emerges is of passive Africans sitting on a pile of gold, waiting for traders from outside to come and take it. The reality was entirely different. The goldfields were controlled and protected by the local rulers. Access was limited and regulated. The terms of trade were negotiated by people who knew exactly what they had and what it was worth. The Arab geographers who wrote about West African gold often noted with frustration that the actual miners kept themselves hidden. That trade took place through a system sometimes called silent trade, in which one party would leave goods at a designated spot and withdraw, and the other party would come, examine the goods, leave gold if satisfied with the offer, and withdraw in turn, so that the two groups never actually met. This system protected the miners' anonymity and their control over the goldfields. It also prevented the traders from gaining any knowledge that might help them circumvent the system or develop their own access to the gold sources. The rulers who sat between the goldfields and the northern markets taxed everything. They taxed the gold coming out of the mining regions. They taxed the salt and other goods coming south from the Sahara. They taxed the merchants who used the routes through their territories. They taxed the use of their weights and measures in the markets. They taxed storage of goods in their warehouses. This was not crude extraction. It was a sophisticated fiscal system, one that recognized the value of what passed through the territory and found ways to capture a portion of that value for the state. The rulers of Ghana and Mali and Songhai were not lucky recipients of geographic good fortune. They were operators of a complex economic machine, and the revenues from that machine funded their courts and their armies and their building programs and their patronage of scholarship. When we think about Mansa Musa crossing the Sahara with 100 camel loads of gold, we should understand that this was not the total wealth of his empire. It was not even close to it. It was what he chose to bring on a single journey, for a combination of religious, diplomatic, and commercial reasons. The wealth that remained in Mali, that continued to flow through the trade routes year after year, was vastly larger. And yet that wealth, which seemed so inexhaustible to the people who lived within it, was actually dependent on a set of conditions that could change. The goldfields were finite. The trade routes could be disrupted. The political structures that maintained the peace necessary for commerce could fracture. The climate that made the Sahel productive could shift. All of these things happened. All of them contributed, in different ways and on different timescales, to the eventual decline of the great West African trading empires. The gold continued to exist in the ground. It was still there when the Portuguese arrived on the coast in the 15th century, when the Atlantic trade replaced the Saharan trade, when the wealth of West Africa began to flow south and west to the coast rather than north to Morocco and Egypt. But the institutional framework that had processed that gold, that had built cities and universities and scholarly traditions around the revenue from that gold, was dismantled by the shift in trade routes. The gold did not stop being gold. The human structures built around the gold were simply rerouted. Let us think about the salt side of the equation as well, because it is less celebrated than the gold and equally important. Taghaza. The name means nothing to most people outside specialized historical circles, but for centuries it was one of the most important places in the world. It was a salt mining settlement in the middle of the Sahara, roughly midway between Morocco and the Niger Bend, at a spot where geological processes had deposited enormous quantities of rock salt close enough to the surface to be quarried. The people who lived and worked at Taghaza were, by multiple historical accounts, enslaved people, brought there to do work that free people would not willingly do in conditions that were genuinely brutal. The heat was extreme, the isolation was total, the work was back-breaking. They quarried the salt in slabs, cutting it from the ground with tools, loading it onto camels, sending it south toward markets where it would be traded for gold and goods. The buildings of Taghaza were made of the salt itself, as mentioned earlier, which gives us a sense of how abundant and how central the material was to the place. Walls of compressed salt, roofs of salt, a town built from the thing it produced. Visitors described it as an eerie and otherworldly place, a settlement that seemed almost like a mirage, a city of white in the middle of the desert. There was another great salt mine, Taoudeni, which eventually replaced Taghaza after a Moroccan force destroyed the settlement in the 16th century. Taoudeni remains operational today, one of the last places in the world where salt is mined by traditional methods in the middle of the Sahara. The conditions there today are still harsh, and accounts from journalists and human rights workers who have visited in recent years describe situations that bear uncomfortable resemblances to the historical slave mining operations. The salt from these mines traveled south across the Sahara on camel caravans that followed routes that were essentially unchanged for centuries. The caravan would assemble at a staging point in the north, often a Moroccan city like Sijil Massa or Marrakesh, and then set out into the desert. The timing was critical. Too early in the season and the heat was murderous. Too late, and you risked the cold of the desert winter. The experienced caravan leaders knew the rhythms of the desert the way a farmer knows the rhythms of the seasons, with a detailed, practical, life or death knowledge that was not available in any book. Crossing the Sahara took approximately 70 days, give or take, depending on the route, the condition of the animals, the weather, and the political situation along the way. 70 days of walking across sand and gravel and rock, navigating by stars at night and by subtle landscape features during the day, stopping at wells that might be dry or that might be controlled by hostile parties, enduring heat that could kill a poorly prepared traveler in hours. The camels made it possible. The camel, which arrived in West Africa from Arabia sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, was arguably the most transformative technology in the history of the trans-Saharan trade. Before the camel, crossing the Sahara was possible only on foot, with donkeys and horses that could not carry enough water to survive the long stretches between wells. The camel changed the calculus entirely. A camel could go for days, in some conditions weeks, without drinking. It could carry enormous loads. It was adapted to the sand in ways that other pack animals were not, its broad feet splaying to give purchase on loose surfaces. It could eat the sparse desert vegetation that other animals ignored. The camel made the Sahara crossable, predictably and commercially, in a way it had not been before, and that crossability made Timbuktu possible. The caravans that converged on the city from the north were camel caravans, their rhythm, their timing, their capacity, all determined by the capabilities of this one extraordinary animal. And so when we imagine Timbuktu at its height, we should populate it with camels, with the smell of camels, which is distinctive and not exactly pleasant, with the sounds of camels, their complaints and grunts, and the deep gurgling protests they make when loaded and unloaded, with the teams of handlers who knew the animals individually, who understood their moods and their needs and their limits. The camels that arrived in Timbuktu with salt loads from the north were carrying more than trade goods. They were carrying the centuries-long history of a human adaptation to one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The scholars. Let us come back to the scholars, because they are the most remarkable thing about Timbuktu and the thing the history of the city most wants us to understand. The tradition of Islamic scholarship that flourished in Timbuktu had its roots in the earliest centuries of Islam, in the great intellectual explosion that followed the founding of the religion in the 7th century, and its rapid spread across the Arabian Peninsula, into Persia and the Byzantine territories, across North Africa and into Spain. The early Muslim scholars were not only theologians, they were translators, philosophers, mathematicians, doctors, astronomers, linguists. They gathered the intellectual traditions of the ancient world, the Greek philosophical tradition, the Persian mathematical tradition, the Indian astronomical tradition, and engaged with them, translated them, debated them, extended them. The Library of Alexandria, which had once been the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was gone, but the tradition it represented had not died. It had been absorbed and transformed, and carried forward by scholars working in Arabic, in cities from Baghdad to Cordoba. When Islam reached West Africa through the trade routes, it brought this entire tradition with it. Not all at once, and not in full, but gradually, carried in the luggage of merchants and in the memories of itinerant scholars, and in the pages of books that made the long journey south across the Sahara. The Muslim merchants who settled in the trading cities of West Africa needed mosques, and mosques needed imams who knew the Quran, and imams needed training, and training required books and teachers. The chain of scholarly transmission that connected Timbuktu to Cairo and Fez and Baghdad was not a chain of equals in the beginning. Timbuktu was at the periphery, receiving from the center. The scholars who came to study in Timbuktu came from the center, and they brought with them not only knowledge, but the social infrastructure of knowledge, the habits of debate and commentary, the practice of copying and collecting manuscripts, the value placed on the student-teacher relationship, the understanding that scholarship was a form of religious practice. But over time, Timbuktu stopped being at the periphery. It developed its own scholarly tradition, its own interpretive schools, its own famous teachers who attracted students from the Islamic world centers. The relationship reversed. Instead of receiving scholars from Egypt and Morocco, Timbuktu began sending scholars there. The great teachers of Timbuktu were invited to the courts of Moroccan sultans and the councils of Egyptian scholars. Their opinions on points of law were sought and respected by scholars in cities they had never visited. Ahmad Baba, the scholar we have already met, is the most famous example of this reversal. When he was exiled to Morocco, he did not arrive as a student seeking to learn from the great Moroccan scholars. He arrived as a peer, as a scholar of equivalent standing and arguably greater accomplishment in certain areas. Even in chains, even in exile, his learning commanded respect. He taught in Marrakesh. Scholars came from across Morocco to study with him. The man who had been exiled as a captive became, paradoxically, a presence of enormous intellectual authority in the city of his captivity. This tells us something important about what Timbuktu had become. A city that could produce scholars of such quality and such depth that even their exile only exported their influence. A city whose intellectual tradition was strong enough to survive the removal of its greatest practitioners and continue, if diminished, after their departure and eventual return. The question the manuscripts ask us is this: if the tradition was so strong, why did we not know about it? The answer is that we, meaning the Western world, the heirs of the colonial era and its particular telling of world history, chose not to look. The manuscripts were not hidden, not in any absolute sense. They were in Timbuktu, which the colonial administration had administrative responsibility for and physical access to. French scholars could have gone there, could have commissioned translations, could have engaged with the intellectual tradition they were sitting on top of. Some did, but not many, and their efforts were marginal within the larger colonial project, which had no particular interest in discovering that the people it was administering had once had universities and libraries. The invisibility of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage in the Western scholarly tradition is not a mystery about manuscripts hidden in sealed rooms. It is a choice made over and over again, across generations, to look elsewhere, to value differently, to tell a particular story about human civilization that left out the cities of the Niger Bend. That choice is being reversed, slowly and imperfectly, now. The manuscripts are being digitized. The scholars who study them are producing work that is entering the global academic conversation. The story of Timbuktu's intellectual life is becoming part of what we mean when we talk about the history of human knowledge. It is late work. It should have been done long before, but it is being done. Let us trace one manuscript, or rather, one type of manuscript, through its journey, to understand what these objects actually are and what they mean. Imagine a legal case in 15th century Timbuktu. Two merchants have a dispute over the terms of a contract. One says the agreed price for a shipment of salt was 50 gold mitkals. The other says it was 45. There are no written records of the agreement, as the negotiation was verbal, conducted in a marketplace under time pressure, as these things often were. Both men take their case to a qadi, a Muslim judge, whose authority in such matters derives from his mastery of Islamic jurisprudence and his appointment by the political authority of the city. The qadi listens. He asks questions. He considers the testimony of witnesses, and then he reaches into a tradition of legal reasoning that stretches back centuries, through commentaries on the Quran and the Hadith, through the opinions of earlier scholars, through the great legal texts that his own teachers had taught him from, and that their teachers had taught them from. He produces an opinion, and then, because he is a scholar as well as a judge, and because the case raises interesting questions of legal interpretation, he writes about it. He writes a commentary, a few pages, considering the principles at stake, the precedents that apply, the reasoning that leads to his conclusion. This commentary is written out in the careful Arabic script that the scholars of Timbuktu used for all their formal writing, on paper brought north from Egypt or vellum prepared locally. That commentary is then copied by a student. It joins the stream of legal opinion that flows through the city, gets referenced by other scholars considering similar cases, gets included in collections of legal opinions, gets carried to other cities along the trade routes, where other scholars read it and respond to it and incorporate it into their own thinking. 500 years later, that commentary is in a manuscript collection in a room in Timbuktu. The paper is yellowed and fragile. Some of the ink has faded at the edges, but the text is still legible, still comprehensible to anyone who reads Arabic and has a grounding in Islamic jurisprudence. It is a document about a contract dispute between two salt merchants in a city that most of the world thinks is a myth. And it is also a document about how human beings have always tried to solve the problem of justice, how they have always tried to build systems for resolving disputes, for determining what is fair, for balancing competing claims. The specific context is 15th century Timbuktu. The fundamental human project is universal. This is what the manuscripts are, at their most basic level. They are records of human beings trying to work things out, trying to understand the world they live in, trying to treat each other fairly, trying to know more than they already know. They are, in this sense, exactly the same as every other manuscript tradition in human history, from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, to the papyri of Egypt, to the parchment books of European monasteries. The specific language and religion and cultural context differ. The human impulse is identical. To dismiss Timbuktu as a myth, or as a curiosity, or as a symbol of remoteness, is to fail to recognize this basic human universality. The scholars of Timbuktu were not exotic practitioners of some alien intellectual tradition. They were people doing what people always do when they are given the conditions to do it. They were thinking and writing and arguing and trying to understand. The Sahara at noon is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not experienced it. The heat is not merely hot. It is a physical presence, a weight, something that presses on the body and the mind simultaneously. The light is so bright that the world loses shadow, loses the depth and dimension that shadow provides, becomes flat and overwhelming. The air is so dry that the moisture in your breath is taken from you, before you have finished exhaling. Your skin dries, your eyes ache, your lips crack. The men who crossed this desert with caravans, who spent 70 days walking through this environment, were not doing something casual. They were doing something that required extraordinary physical endurance, extraordinary mental resilience, and extraordinary knowledge of where they were and how to survive where they were. We should sit with this for a moment, because one of the things that gets lost in the narrative of Timbuktu's rise is the sheer physical difficulty of the world in which it existed. The city was not conveniently located. It was not on a coast, with easy access to the sea and the trade networks the sea enabled. It was not in a temperate climate, with reliable rainfall and moderate temperatures. It was at the edge of a desert, connected to the rest of the world only by routes that killed the unprepared and tested the prepared to their limits. The fact that a city of 100,000 people, with a university of 25,000 students and libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, existed in this location is not something to glide past. It is something to sit with in astonishment. The people who built Timbuktu were not working with easy conditions. They were making civilization in one of the hardest places on earth, and they were doing it well enough to produce something that the rest of the world has been dimly aware of ever since. The desert was both the obstacle and the enabler. Without the desert, there would have been no trans-Saharan trade, because there would have been no Sahara to cross and no particular value in crossing it. The harsh conditions that made the trade valuable, the scarcity of salt, the distance between the gold of the south and the markets of the north, were created by the desert. The desert made Timbuktu necessary, and then the desert came closer and made Timbuktu difficult. And then the desert continued and made Timbuktu marginal. The relationship between the city and its climate is the deepest story of Timbuktu. Deeper than the empires, deeper than the scholars, deeper than the invasions and the exiles and the manuscripts. The city exists at a climatic hinge point, a place where the productive world and the barren world meet, and the location of that hinge shifts over time. When the rains moved north, Timbuktu was surrounded by enough vegetation to support its population. When the rains moved south, the desert pressed in, and the city struggled. We are in a period of climate change now, and the Sahara continues to be affected by that change. The Sahel has experienced both periods of expansion of the desert and, in recent decades, some greening in certain areas as rainfall patterns shift in complex ways. The future of Timbuktu is tied, as it always has been, to the future of its climate, and the future of its climate is tied, now, to choices being made by people on the other side of the planet who have probably never thought about Timbuktu at all. This is one more layer of the story, one more connection between the particular and the universal. The city that trade built and scholarship filled and conquest diminished and drought reduced is now waiting to see what a warming planet will do to the conditions that have sustained it. Barely and imperfectly, for 1,000 years, the young woman carrying water. This is an image I want you to hold as we move toward the end of this story. Not a king, not a scholar, not a conqueror. A young woman in Timbuktu, carrying water in a clay pot on her head, moving through the narrow streets between the old mud brick buildings. She might be carrying water in the 11th century, when the city was just becoming itself. She might be carrying water in the 15th century, when the scholars were writing their manuscripts and the university at Sankore was full of students. She might be carrying water in the 17th century after the Moroccan invasion, in a city that is quieter and poorer than it was. She might be carrying water now, in the 21st century, in a city that has been occupied by armed extremists and rescued by French troops and is still figuring out what it is going to be next. She is always carrying water, because water was, and is, the most fundamental requirement of life in this landscape, because the wells and the river and the seasonal rains that determined whether there would be enough water were always the deepest layer of the story, because the young woman carrying water to her family's house was doing the daily work of survival that made possible every other thing, every manuscript and mosque and market that the history books write about. History tends to focus on the exceptional, the kings and the scholars and the conquerors and the travelers who left accounts. The young women carrying water do not leave accounts. They are invisible in the documents. but they are the foundation. They are always the foundation. Timbuktu's story is partly the story of exceptional people doing exceptional things in unusual circumstances. But it is also, beneath that, the story of ordinary people doing ordinary things in a particular place across a very long time. The potters making the clay pots, the farmers growing the millet, the children learning to read the Quran in the neighborhood school, the women carrying water, the old men sitting outside the mosque in the cool of the early morning, talking about nothing in particular. These people do not have their names in the manuscripts, but the manuscripts would not exist without them. The scholars ate the food the farmers grew. They drank the water the young women carried. They lived in houses built by craftspeople and maintained by people whose names are lost. Civilization is not made only by the people who write things down. It is made by everyone who does the daily work of keeping life going, who tends to the 1,000 necessary things that create the conditions in which scholarship and commerce and art become possible. When we honor Timbuktu, when we resist the reduction of it to a punchline, we are honoring all of them. The scholars, yes, but also the farmers and the potters and the camel herders and the young women carrying water. All of them were part of what Timbuktu was. All of them contributed to the thing that survived. One of the most haunting aspects of Timbuktu's story is what did not survive. We know the manuscripts that remain. We can read them, study them, marvel at them, but we cannot know the ones that were lost. And given everything the city went through, given the Moroccan invasion and the subsequent looting, the centuries of drought and economic decline, the French colonial period's indifference, the 2012 crisis, it is certain that much was lost. The manuscripts that survived are likely a fraction of what once existed. What did those lost manuscripts contain? We cannot know. But we can infer, from the range and depth of what survives, that what was lost was of similar quality and similar ambition. Medical knowledge we do not have, mathematical discoveries we have not made, historical records of events we know nothing about, legal reasoning that might have illuminated corners of Islamic jurisprudence that remain obscure, poetry, personal letters, the particular texture of individual lives, the things that people wrote when they were not writing for posterity but for immediate purposes. This is the loss that is hardest to measure. Not the manuscripts we know were destroyed, but the ones we cannot imagine because we do not know they existed. The lacunae in our knowledge of West African history are not empty space. They are filled with things that once existed and no longer do. The scholars who study the surviving manuscripts sometimes describe a particular feeling that comes over them when they encounter a text that refers to another text, a commentary or a summary, or a response to a work that no longer exists. The scholar is reading a document that was written in conversation with another document, and the other document is gone, and the conversation becomes one-sided, and you are reading half a dialogue whose other half has been silenced. This is what conquest does to civilizations. It does not only destroy buildings and kill people and disrupt economies, it destroys conversations. It silences voices in the middle of arguments that deserve to continue. It cuts threads of inquiry that would have led somewhere, that were leading somewhere, and leaves the scholars of the future trying to reconstruct the logic of a mind they can only half perceive. Every scholar who studies the Timbuktu manuscripts is working against this silence. Every translation, every digitization, every seminar where a fragment of these texts is discussed and debated is a small act of restoration, not of the texts themselves, but of the conversation. The conversation that was interrupted is slowly, imperfectly resuming. It will never be complete. The things that were lost are lost, but the things that survived are extraordinary, and they are demanding to be heard, and there are people in Timbuktu and in universities around the world who are giving them the attention they deserve. The walls of the Jingareba Mosque are not smooth. From the outside, you can see the wooden beams that project from the surface, called toron, which serve a structural purpose in mud brick construction, providing scaffolding points for the annual maintenance and repair that keeps the building from dissolving back into the earth. They give the walls a bristled, organic quality, like something that is partly animal, partly architectural. Every year, before the rainy season, The people of the neighborhoods around the mosque gather for a collective replastering. This is not a tourist activity. This is not a preservation project funded by an international organization. It is a community practice that has been happening in various forms for centuries. The community takes responsibility for the mosque that the community built and that the community uses, and that is, in a profound sense, the community made visible in architecture. This practice of collective maintenance is itself a kind of manuscript, a text written not in ink on paper, but in mud, applied to walls, and the memory of hands that have done this before, and the knowledge passed from parent to child about how to mix the plaster and where the weak points are and why this particular wall needs attention before that one. It is knowledge in action, embodied knowledge, the kind that cannot be digitized. The city's mosques are maintained in this way, not because there is money for professional conservation, though international funding has helped with the more dramatic repairs, but because the people who live in Timbuktu understand these buildings as theirs in a way that goes beyond property. These are not monuments to the dead. They are working buildings, still used for prayer 5 times a day, still organizing the rhythm of the city's spiritual life, still the points around which the neighborhoods cluster and the community defines itself. This continuity is remarkable. The Jingareba Mosque was built in the early 14th century during the reign of Mansa Musa in a form that traces back to the architectural ideas al-Sahili brought from Andalusia. It has been rebuilt and repaired and modified over 7 centuries. Almost nothing of its original structure survives in its original form, and yet it is continuous with its origin in a way that matters, that is not merely symbolic. The people who maintained it kept their relationship with it across every disruption that passed through the city. The Moroccan invasion, the French colonization, the 2012 occupation, none of it broke the chain of maintenance and use and daily prayer that keeps the mosque alive. This is what resilience looks like at its most fundamental. Not dramatic resistance, not armed defense, just the quiet continuation of practice across time, the decision made by generation after generation that this particular thing is worth maintaining, that it matters enough to patch the walls every year before the rains come. The Niger River at dawn is orange. The light catches the water from a particular angle in the early morning, and for a brief period the river seems to be made of something denser than water, something that holds the light rather than simply reflecting it. The fishermen who go out on the river at dawn have seen this thousands of times, and they still notice it, because the light of the early morning on the Niger is the kind of thing that keeps announcing itself even after a lifetime of watching. The river boats of the Niger are long and narrow, made from wooden planks and sealed against the water with local materials. They carry people and animals and goods up and down the river the way they always have, connecting the communities along the banks to each other and to the wider world. The technology has not changed dramatically in several centuries, though outboard motors have appeared alongside the traditional paddles and poles. What has changed is the volume of traffic. The Niger was once a highway, the primary connection between the Niger Bend and the southern parts of West Africa, a route along which gold and cola nuts and cloth and agricultural produce and people moved constantly. The boat builders who worked its banks and the families who operated its boats were part of a transportation industry that was essential to the prosperity of every city along its course. The river is still there, it still flows, but the trade that once made it a highway has been reorganized around roads and trucks, and eventually around international shipping containers and air freight, a global logistics system that connects the coastal cities of West Africa to the rest of the world in ways that make the Niger River boats seem quaint and insufficient. For the people who live along the Niger, this reorganization is not an abstraction. It means that their river, which was once the center of the economic world they inhabit, is now peripheral to it. The boats still carry goods, but not the goods that drive the region's economy. The river still connects communities, but not in ways that generate significant wealth. The fishermen still go out at dawn, and the light is still orange, and the fish are still there, though in smaller numbers than they once were, because the pressures of population growth and changing fishing methods have reduced the fish stocks of the inland delta in recent decades. The Niger is still beautiful, still important to the people who live along it, still essential, in ways that are not captured by economic statistics. But it is no longer what it was when the boat traffic on it was part of a trade network that connected the gold of Guinea to the markets of North Africa. It is a diminished thing, even as it remains a remarkable one. When we step back from the details of Timbuktu's history, when we take in the whole arc from the Green Sahara to the manuscript digitization projects of the 21st century, we see something that is worth naming directly. The story of Timbuktu is a story about what civilizations require to flourish and what destroys them. It is a case study in the conditions that make cities possible and the conditions that make them impossible in the long timescales over which these conditions operate. A city like Timbuktu requires, at minimum, a source of economic activity that generates surplus wealth, a political structure stable enough to protect that activity and invest the surplus productively, a climate that can support the necessary population, and a position within the larger networks of trade and communication that connects it to the resources and the ideas it needs to sustain itself. Timbuktu had all of these things at its height. In fortunate combination, the trans-Saharan trade provided the surplus. The great empires of Ghana and Mali and Songhai provided the political stability. The Sahel climate, in its relatively productive phase, provided the agricultural base, and the position at the top of the Niger Bend provided the geographic centrality. Each of these conditions eroded, over time, for different reasons. The trade was rerouted by the Portuguese sea route and the Atlantic economy. The political stability was shattered by the Moroccan invasion and its aftermath. The climate shifted, drying further, pushing the desert closer, and the geographic position that had been central to the Saharan trade network became peripheral to the Atlantic one. No single one of these changes destroyed Timbuktu. All of them together, operating across different timescales, hollowed it out until what remained was a shell of what it had been, impressive in its persistence, but fundamentally altered in its capacity. This is how civilizations die. Not with a bang, usually, with a long, complicated, multi-causal diminishment that no single person and no single decision caused, and that therefore no single person or decision could have prevented. But civilizations also persist. They persist in the things they produce that survive longer than the conditions that produce them. The manuscripts of Timbuktu outlasted the trade routes that funded their creation. The mosques outlasted the empire that built them. The scholarly tradition, attenuated and damaged, but not destroyed, persisted through the Moroccan occupation and the French colonial period and the 2012 crisis. And now, in the 21st century, there are people working to bring the intellectual heritage of Timbuktu back into conversation with the rest of the world. Scholars who are learning Arabic to read the manuscripts. Digital archivists who are creating systems to store and share images of fragile documents. Teachers in the schools of Timbuktu who are trying to help their students understand that they are the inheritors of a tradition that the world has systematically undervalued and that deserves to be known. This work is happening. It is not happening fast enough. It is not happening with enough resources. The security situation in northern Mali remains precarious, and the fear of another crisis like 2012 never fully recedes. The economic situation in Timbuktu, and in Mali more broadly, remains very difficult. And economic difficulty makes cultural preservation harder. But the work is happening, and there is something in that. Something worth resting on in the quiet of the night. We are coming to the end of this night's journey. Not to the end of Timbuktu's story, because that story continues. Right now, as you lie in the dark wherever you are listening to this, Timbuktu is there. The mosques are standing. The remaining manuscripts, those that have been returned and those that survived in situ through all the crises, are in their libraries and their family collections. The scholars who study them are working on the other side of the world's time zones to understand what they contain. The people of the city are going about their lives. The city is not what it was. It may never be again what it was. The conditions that made it great were specific to a particular moment in the history of trade and climate and political organization. And those conditions are not going to be recreated. The trans-Saharan caravan trade is not coming back. the Songhai Empire is not being re-established. The particular combination of factors that made it possible for 100,000 people to live around the Niger Bend, sustained by the gold and salt trade and organized around the great mosques and their attendant schools, is not going to repeat itself. But cities, even diminished cities, have a way of persisting, of finding new reasons to exist, of adapting, slowly and imperfectly, to changed conditions. Timbuktu is trying to do this. The heritage tourism that the manuscripts and mosques can attract, carefully managed and thoughtfully developed, could provide an economic base. The growing global interest in the intellectual history of West Africa could put Timbuktu on a different map than the one where it has been a punchline. The digitization of the manuscripts could make the city a center, not of physical scholarship in the way it once was, but of digital scholarship, a node in a global network of researchers and institutions interested in medieval Islamic learning and West African history. These are possibilities, not certainties. They require investment, stability, and time, none of which can be guaranteed. But they are real possibilities. And the fact that they are real is itself a testament to what Timbuktu built across those centuries of flourishing. The manuscripts are an asset. The mosques are an asset. The tradition of scholarship and learning, however attenuated, is an asset. These things survived because they were valuable enough for people to protect them, and they remain valuable enough to build a future on. The night in the Sahara does not last forever. Eventually, very early, before the heat has fully committed to the day, there is a moment when the stars begin to fade at the edges of the sky, and the east shows a line of lighter dark. The roosters respond to this, as they always do, with their confident announcement that the day is coming, whether you are ready for it or not. The muezzin calls. The call to morning prayer echoes from the minarets of the three great mosques. It sounds the way it has always sounded, in the particular acoustic environment of a city of low, flat-roofed, mud-brick buildings surrounded by open desert, clear and resonant and slightly extended, the sound traveling farther than you would expect. People rise. They wash their hands and faces. They arrange themselves in the direction of Mecca. They pray. They have been doing this in this city, in these mosques, or the mosques that stood before them, for 6 or 7 centuries. This is the continuity that survives everything. Not the political structures, which came and went, not the economic arrangements, which rose and fell with the trade routes, not even the specific knowledge preserved in the manuscripts, which was damaged and scattered and partially lost, the daily practice of prayer, the daily rhythm of call and response between the muezzin and the faithful, the daily renewal of the relationship between a community and the tradition that gives it coherence. In the morning light, the mud brick walls of Timbuktu glow in that particular warm color that looks almost like gold. The wooden beams project from the walls of the mosques, casting the short shadows of early morning. The streets are quiet, not yet filled with the sounds of a city going about its business. For a moment, in the early light, you can almost see it. Not as it is, but as it was. The streets filling with students on their way to the Sankhri Mosque, the caravans being loaded in the market district, the camels complaining as the salt slabs are secured to their backs, the sound of a scholar dictating to a student, the scratch of a reed pen on paper, the smell of the river carried on the morning breeze from a few miles away. It was real. All of it was real. The golden city everyone thinks is a myth was real, and it was magnificent. And it fell, and it persisted, and it is still there, carrying its history the way the old mosques carry the marks of every reign and every restoration, imperfectly and completely, and with a kind of stubborn grace. That is the story. That is Timbuktu. Good night, wherever you are. Let the quiet settle in. Let the images dissolve slowly. The caravan crossing the sand, the scholar bent over his manuscript, the young woman carrying water, the muezzin's call in the early morning desert air. Let the golden city rest. It has been waiting a long time to be remembered. It is not in a hurry. There are things that only night travelers know. The person who drives a long road after midnight, watching the headlights pool on empty asphalt and the dark press in at the edges. The sailor who keeps watch in the small hours when the stars are at their most absolute and the ship seems to be the only human thing in existence. The scholar who works past the time when everyone else has gone to bed alone with a text and a lamp and the particular silence of a house that is given over to sleep. Night travelers know that the world has a different quality in the dark. Not worse, not frightening, though it can be that. Different. The edges of things soften. The hard definitions of the daylight world, this is here and that is there, and these two things are separate, become less certain. Things that seemed separate in the light begin to feel connected. Distances compress. Times fold. You are listening to this in the dark, probably, or in the soft light of a lamp, in a room that the night has made quiet. And across the world, in a time zone many hours away from wherever you are, Timbuktu is in its own light, its own phase of the daily cycle, going about its own version of whatever ordinary life looks like, now in a city that has been extraordinary and is still trying to understand what it is. The distance between you and Timbuktu is real. It is thousands of miles, depending on where you are. It is a flight and a long drive on uncertain roads, and a particular combination of heat and dust that most people who are comfortable never seek out voluntarily. It is genuinely far away, but the distance is also, in the night, compressed by story. You have spent time in Timbuktu tonight, not physically, not literally, but in the way that matters when we talk about understanding a place. You have been there. You have walked its streets in the 15th century, when the caravans unloaded their salt and the students crowded around the mosques. You have seen the Moroccan army arrive with its guns. You have sat with Ahmad Baba in his chains. You have watched the manuscripts being loaded into rice sacks in the night. This is what stories do. They collapse distance. They make the past, present, and the far near. They take a city that most people use as a punchline and give it back its full weight, its full color, its full complexity. They restore what dismissal takes away. Let us spend a little more time in the 15th century, because it is the era that most deserves our attention. The era of the city's greatest confidence, before the shadow of what was coming had fallen over it, before the Portuguese ships had rounded the Cape and the sea route had begun its long erosion of the desert trade. The year is, let us say, 1468. The year Sunni Ali's army is approaching from the east, and Timbuktu is about to change hands from the weakening Mali Empire to the rising Songhai. But the change has not happened yet. For this moment, the city is still in the interregnum, still belonging to the old order that is about to give way. A scholar named Mahmud Kati is teaching. He is, by the accounts that survive, a remarkable man, born around 1468, which means he is entering the world at precisely the moment we have chosen to stand in. He will live for a long time, possibly past 100 years, an extraordinarily long life even by modern standards, and almost unimaginable in the context of the 15th century. He will write one of the most important historical texts produced in Timbuktu, the Tariq al-Fatash, or the Chronicle of the Seeker, a history of the Western Sudan that documents the empires and the scholars and the events of his lifetime and before. His family had come from Andalusia, from the Muslim Spain that the Christian kingdoms were slowly reconquering, and had settled in the region of the Niger Bend over several generations. He was, like many of the scholars of Timbuktu, a person of mixed origins. His identity formed at the intersection of multiple traditions, Arabic and Mande, and West African, Muslim and Andalusian, and Sahelian. Mahmud Kati worked at the court of Askia Muhammad, the great Songhai ruler who would come to power in 1493. He was the emperor's secretary, his intellectual companion, the man who turned the emperor's decrees into the formal Arabic prose that connected the Songhai court to the wider world of Islamic governance. He was also a scholar in his own right, teaching, collecting manuscripts, thinking. The Tariq al-Fatash that he began writing would be continued by his grandson after his death, incorporating events that Mahmud Kati himself could not have witnessed. This continuity, the passing of a scholarly project across generations, is itself characteristic of the tradition. Knowledge in Timbuktu was not the possession of individuals. It was an inheritance, something passed along a chain of custody that extended backward into the past and was meant to extend forward into the future. When Mahmud Kati wrote about the court of Askia Muhammad, he was preserving something that he knew, from his experience of his own family's history, could be lost. The Andalusian world his ancestors had come from was gone, overwritten by a new political and cultural order. He had seen what it meant for a civilization to be replaced, for the texts and traditions that defined it to be put under pressure or scattered or forgotten. He wrote, in part, because he understood that writing was protection, that putting things down in ink on paper was a way of making them harder to destroy. He was right, and he was also wrong. The manuscripts that contain the Tariq al-Fatash survived. They are among the collections being studied and digitized now, but the version we have is incomplete. Sections are missing. The continuity that Mahmud Kati hoped for was interrupted, as continuities always are, by the chaotic events of the centuries that followed his death. We have a partial text, a conversation with gaps. Still, we have it. 700 years after the man began writing it, his account of the empires and the scholars of the Niger Bend is being read by scholars in universities on continents that did not exist in Mahmud Kati's cosmology. His words are available in translation. His history is part of the global scholarly record. He wrote, to be remembered. He is remembered. What does it mean to be forgotten? And what does it mean to be remembered? These are questions that Timbuktu forces us to think about, because the city's history is a history of being remembered, then forgotten, then remembered again, in a cycle that has repeated itself several times and has not yet ended. The Islamic world remembered Timbuktu continuously, from the 14th century onward. The scholars of Cairo and Fez and Istanbul knew about the city, had correspondence with its scholars, read its legal opinions and its histories. There was never a period within the Islamic intellectual world when Timbuktu was unknown or dismissed. The forgetting of Timbuktu was a specifically Western phenomenon, a product of the particular way that European civilization organized its memory of the world. This is important to understand. The punchline about Timbuktu, the dismissal of the city as mythical or remote or non-existent, is not a universal human failure. It is a specific cultural failure, a specific choice made by a specific tradition to look in certain directions and not in others. The scholars of the Sankore Mosque were not unknown to their contemporaries in the Islamic world. They were known, respected, engaged with. The forgetting was done by one part of the world to another, which means that the recovery of Timbuktu's history is also a specific cultural act. It is the correction of a specific error. The Western scholarly tradition has been reckoning with its own systematic exclusions for decades now, understanding that the story of human knowledge and human civilization it told to itself and to the world was incomplete, was shaped by power, was missing enormous amounts of what actually happened in human history. Timbuktu is one of the places where that reckoning is happening most clearly. The manuscripts are not just historical documents, they are arguments about what the past contains, what the intellectual traditions of the world encompass, who produced knowledge, and where, and in what languages, and under what conditions. They are arguments against the story that said only certain places and certain peoples generated ideas worth remembering. The Tuareg have a tradition of poetry that is sung rather than written. The poets of the Tuareg, called Imajagan, compose and perform oral texts that encode the history and the values and the aesthetics of their community. This oral tradition has coexisted with the written tradition of the settled city for centuries, the two traditions rubbing against each other, influencing each other, sometimes in conflict and sometimes in concert. The Tuareg poetry celebrates the desert. It celebrates the nomadic life, the freedom of movement, the relationship with animals, the navigation of vast distances without landmarks, the particular kind of knowledge that comes from living in and with the Sahara rather than at its edge. It is a poetics of motion, of space, of the relationship between the human body and an inhospitable landscape. The written tradition of Timbuktu scholars is a poetics of settlement, of accumulation, of the relationship between the human mind and the texts it produces and inherits. It is a tradition of libraries and commentaries and the careful preservation of what previous generations have thought. These two traditions, the oral and the written, the nomadic and the settled, the desert and the city, have been the twin poles of the Niger Bend for as long as human beings have lived there. The city needed the desert people, needed their knowledge and their connections to the trade routes and their control of the caravan infrastructure. The desert people needed the city, needed its markets and its water and its concentrated economic power, and they were also in perpetual tension. The Tuareg raided Timbuktu multiple times. Across the centuries, Tuareg groups forced the city to pay tribute or simply took what they could when the political structure that protected the city was weak. The city's walls were built partly in response to this threat. The relationship was never simply peaceful, but it was also never simply hostile. The Tuareg, who traded in Timbuktu's markets, were doing business with a city they also sometimes raided. The scholars who hired Tuareg guides to take them across the desert to North Africa were dependent on the skills of people whose political relationship with their city was ambivalent at best. This complicated entanglement, this mixture of cooperation and conflict, competition and interdependence, is one of the defining dynamics of Timbuktu's history. It continues. The Tuareg, who participated in the 2012 uprising that briefly put Timbuktu under extremist control, were not simply external aggressors. They were people with complex historical relationships to the city and its territory, relationships that included legitimate grievances about political marginalization and economic neglect that post-colonial Mali had not adequately addressed. The story of 2012 is not a story of good people defending a city from bad people who had no connection to it. It is a story of multiple groups with conflicting interests and legitimate grievances colliding in a moment of regional instability. The manuscripts were caught in the middle, as they always are when the political conflicts of the region flare up. There is a particular kind of melancholy that attaches itself to great things that have diminished. It is different from the sadness of loss, where the thing is simply gone. It is the sadness of persistence, of presence, of a thing that is still there but is no longer what it was. A grand house that has become a ruin, but a ruin that still stands. A river that has shrunk but still flows. A city that had 100,000 people and now has 30,000. The form persists. The scale does not. Timbuktu has this quality. The mosques are there. They are real mosques, functioning, maintained, used for prayer every day. They are not ruins. But they were once the centers of a university city, the organizing nodes of an intellectual community that drew students from across the Islamic world. They are still beautiful. They are still important to the people who live around them. But the students are not coming from Cairo and Morocco anymore. The great debates about jurisprudence and astronomy that once animated the spaces around these buildings are not happening in the same way. There is a phrase in Arabic, the Arabic of the medieval Islamic world, that was the language of Timbuktu's scholars. The ruins speak. It refers to the ancient Arab practice of visiting ruins, of standing in a place where a great civilization once stood and feeling the melancholy of its absence. The Arabic poets of the classical period wrote about this at length, standing before the ruins of a beloved's camp and letting the absence of what had been there speak through the silence of what remained. The scholars of Timbuktu knew this tradition. They wrote about it, and now, in a way that they could not have anticipated, the ruins of their own civilization's great period are the subject of this same kind of contemplation. But I want to resist the full weight of that melancholy, because the ruins of Timbuktu are not quiet. The manuscripts are not silent. They are actively demanding attention, actively forcing themselves back into the conversation they were removed from. The people who are working to preserve and translate and study these documents are not simply mourning what was lost. They are retrieving something that is still usable, still capable of contributing to the ongoing project of human knowledge and human understanding. The ruins speak. And in Timbuktu, they are getting louder. As we move now, finally and gently, toward the end of this night, I want to offer something that is not exactly history and not exactly philosophy, but somewhere between the two. The story of Timbuktu is a story about the relationship between knowledge and power. Knowledge, in Timbuktu's golden age, was power. The scholars, who were the city's most respected residents, were not powerful because they had armies or because they controlled trade routes. They were powerful because they possessed and produced and transmitted knowledge, because they were the people who understood what the text said and could apply that understanding to the questions that mattered. Their authority was the authority of expertise and tradition, and the Islamic imperative to seek and share learning. When the Moroccan army arrived with its guns, it had a different kind of power, a more immediate kind, more capable of producing compliance in the short term. The scholars discovered, painfully, that their power, which had seemed so secure, so embedded in the structures of the city, could be swept aside in an afternoon by a force that did not recognize it as power at all. And yet the scholars' power proved more durable. The Moroccan pashas who displaced them are not remembered. The armies that escorted the salt caravans are not remembered. But Ahmad Baba is remembered. Mahmud Kati is remembered. The manuscripts they produced and the tradition they sustained are the reason we are still talking about Timbuktu, the reason the city has not simply become one of the thousands of places that existed and were forgotten and left no trace. The guns of the Moroccan army are long since rusted to nothing. The manuscripts endure. This is not a counsel of naive optimism, not a suggestion that knowledge always wins in the end, or that the powerful always lose. The history of Timbuktu is full of cases where power destroyed knowledge, where manuscripts were burned and scholars were killed, and intellectual traditions were ended by violence. The victories are partial, and the losses are real, but it is perhaps an observation about timescales. Power, the military and political kind, operates on short timescales. It is immediate and intense, and capable of producing dramatic changes very quickly. Knowledge operates on longer timescales. It accumulates slowly and loses ground slowly, and is harder to destroy completely than it appears, because it lives in many places simultaneously, in the memories of people, and the pages of documents, and the practices of communities, rather than in a single building, or a single army, or a single political arrangement. The trans-Saharan trade route that sustained Timbuktu lasted for centuries. The Songhai Empire at its height seemed permanent, as all empires do to the people who live within them. The Moroccan occupation seemed, in 1591, like it might define the city's future for generations. The manuscripts outlasted all of them. There is one final image. One last thing I want to leave you with, as the night deepens and the story settles. Somewhere in Timbuktu, in a house that has stood for 2 centuries at least, there is a room. The room is not large. It has thick mud brick walls that keep it cool even in the heat of the desert summer. The light comes in through a small window, filtered and gentle. In this room, on wooden shelves and wrapped in cloth, and sometimes just stacked carefully in the corners, there are manuscripts. Some of them are beautifully maintained, their bindings firm, their pages clean and legible. Some of them are fragile, their pages threatening to dissolve at the touch, their ink barely visible. All of them have been here for a long time. The family that owns this collection has known about it for generations. Great-grandfather learned it from his father, who learned it from his father before. The collection includes a letter written by Ahmad Baba from Marrakesh during his captivity to a student he had left behind in Timbuktu. It includes legal opinions written by scholars whose names are not widely known outside specialized circles, but who were important figures in the intellectual life of the city in the 16th and 17th centuries. It includes a manuscript on astronomy that contains calculations whose precision was not exceeded in that particular domain by European astronomy until a century after the text was written. The family knows these things are valuable. They do not know exactly what the manuscripts say, because the Arabic of the classical Islamic tradition is different from the modern Arabic spoken in the region, and reading the old texts requires specialized training. They know the collection is important. They know their ancestors thought it was worth keeping. Someone from the Ahmed Baba Institute is coming next month to assess the collection, to photograph the manuscripts and add them to the digital catalogue that is slowly making the holdings of Timbuktu's private collections available to scholars around the world. The family is cautious about this. They have heard about collections that were taken from their owners and not returned. They have heard about institutions that digitized manuscripts and then used the digital images without properly acknowledging or compensating the families that preserved the originals. They have their own relationship with their inheritance. their own ideas about what it means to be the custodian of something this old and this valuable. But they are opening the room, they are letting the light in. The manuscripts are going to be seen, going to be read, going to be understood. The conversation that was interrupted is going to continue. That is enough. For tonight, that is enough. Good night. Before we let this story fully dissolve into sleep, let us return to something we touched on briefly. The people who made the trade possible at the ground level, not the kings and not the scholars, but the ordinary workers of the caravan system. A camel handler in the 15th century would begin preparing for a major caravan several weeks in advance. The camels needed to be checked over, their feet inspected for sores, their loads balanced against their individual carrying capacities. Different camels had different temperaments and different physical traits, and an experienced handler knew his animals the way a farmer knows his fields, with a particular and personal familiarity that was the product of years of close daily contact. The loads of salt were heavy. A single slab of Saharan salt could weigh 60 or 70 kilograms, and each camel might carry two of them, 250 kilograms total, in addition to the water that the animal itself would need, and the provisions for the handlers and the other supplies that kept a caravan functioning across 70 days of desert travel. The water was the constant anxiety. Every experienced caravan leader knew the distance from one well to the next along every route they used, knew how long the crossing between water sources would take at their best pace and at their worst, knew what to do if a well was dry or had been contaminated. They carried extra water in sealed clay containers and goatskin bags, water that tasted of the container it was stored in, and that was rationed with the mathematical precision of people who understood exactly what would happen if the calculation was wrong. When they arrived in Timbuktu, after weeks in the desert, the handlers cared for their animals before they cared for themselves. The camels were unloaded, watered, fed. They were examined again for injuries sustained on the journey. They were given rest in the animal enclosures at the edge of the city. Only then did the men turn to their own needs, their own hunger and thirst and exhaustion. The handlers were often Tuareg or Berber men whose families had been in the caravan business for generations. Their knowledge of the desert routes was not written down. It was in their bodies, in the memories of landmarks and well locations and seasonal conditions that they had learned by making the journey repeatedly from childhood. This knowledge was passed from father to son and occasionally to daughters who worked alongside the men in the desert, though the women's role in the caravan system is underrepresented in the historical accounts. When the Portuguese sea route opened and the Atlantic trade began to draw the gold away from the trans-Saharan system, these families were not consulted. Their knowledge, accumulated over centuries of desert travel, was not suddenly obsolete, but the commercial system that had made it valuable began to shrink. The big caravans became less frequent, the smaller ones became less profitable. The younger generation looked for different opportunities, and the old knowledge began to fade at the edges, no longer being practiced regularly enough to be transmitted in its full depth. This is another kind of loss. Not dramatic, not visible in any particular document, but real. The knowledge of the desert route handlers, the intimate, practical understanding of the Sahara that had made the trans-Saharan trade possible, diminished along with the trade itself. It was not written down, so it left no manuscripts. It was not formally preserved, so there are no institutions that hold it. It survives only in fragments, in the practices of the smaller caravan operations that continue today, in the oral traditions of the desert communities, in the bodies of the few men and women who still move across the Sahara in the old ways. The language question deserves its own meditation. Arabic was the language of scholarship in Timbuktu. The manuscripts are mostly in Arabic, and the intellectual culture they represent was deeply embedded in the Arabic language and the Islamic textual tradition that Arabic carried. But Arabic was not the language most people in Timbuktu spoke in daily life. The city's population spoke Songhai, the language of the dominant group of the Songhai Empire. They spoke Mande languages, the family of languages that connected the people of the Niger Bend to the broader Mande-speaking world of West Africa. They spoke Tamashek, the Tuareg language of the desert traders. They spoke Fulfulde, the language of the Fulani pastoralists who moved through the region. and they spoke each other's languages in the practical, unsystematic, imperfect way that people in multilingual commercial cities always learn to communicate. The Ajami tradition, the practice of writing West African languages in Arabic script, represents the meeting of these two worlds. Scholars who knew Arabic used it to write down things in their own languages, things that would not fit into the classical Arabic intellectual tradition, things that were too local, too specific, too tied to the particular texture of life in the Sahel, to be expressed in the formal language of international Islamic scholarship. There are manuscripts in Songhai, in Mande languages, in Fulfulde, all written in Arabic characters. There are manuscripts that code switch between Arabic and local languages, using Arabic for the formal, scholarly framing and the local language for the specific content. These multilingual texts are some of the most interesting documents in the Timbuktu collections because they represent a moment of creative cultural synthesis, the adaptation of a tool from one tradition to the needs of another. The scholars who did this were not being derivative. They were solving a problem. They needed to write things down in their own languages, and the only script they had been educated in was Arabic. So they used it. And in using it, they created something new, a body of written literature in languages that had previously been only oral, preserved in a script that connected them to the global tradition of Islamic scholarship. This is how cultures work. They take what they have access to and make it their own, and in the making, they transform both the tool and the tradition. Let us think about time as Timbuktu experienced it. We experience time linearly, mostly, one thing after another, the past behind us, the future ahead. This is a useful model for some purposes, but it is not the only way to experience or understand time. The scholars of Timbuktu experienced time differently, in the sense that the texts they read and wrote connected them to a tradition that stretched back centuries and that they understood themselves as part of. When a scholar in 15th century Timbuktu read a commentary on the Quran written in Baghdad in the 9th century, he was not reading a historical document. He was participating in an ongoing conversation. The 9th century scholar was speaking to him across 6 centuries with as much immediacy as a contemporary colleague. The question the Baghdad scholar had raised was still open, still being debated. The answer he had proposed was still being evaluated. Time had not closed the question. Time had only multiplied the perspectives on it. This is the Islamic scholarly tradition's relationship to time, not a linear sequence of increasingly outdated knowledge, but a cumulative conversation in which the past is always present, always available, always contributing to the current discussion. The great scholars of the tradition are not past, they are present. Their texts are living arguments that you can engage with, agree with, disagree with, extend. This temporality, this sense of being in permanent dialogue with the past, is one reason why the manuscripts of Timbuktu are not simply historical artifacts. They are not records of what people used to think. They are one side of conversations that are, from within the Islamic scholarly tradition, still ongoing. The questions they address are still live questions. The arguments they make are still relevant arguments. When modern scholars read the Timbuktu manuscripts and find legal reasoning that anticipates contemporary discussions in Islamic jurisprudence, they are not discovering something quaint or historical. They are finding a voice that has something to say about the current discussion. The manuscripts speak in the present tense. There are people who walk from Timbuktu to the Niger River. It is about 20 kilometers, not a trivial distance in the heat of the day, though manageable in the cool of the early morning or the evening. People have been making this walk for centuries. Farmers bringing their produce to the river market, fishermen returning from the water, merchants traveling to meet the boats. Along the route, in the flat, semi-arid landscape between the city and the river, there are fragments of old settlement, pottery shards scattered in the sand, the faint outline of old walls, almost impossible to see against the pale ground, places where the ground is darker, stained by the organic matter of old middens, the refuse heaps of communities that are no longer there. The landscape between Timbuktu and the Niger is full of these traces. Archaeologists who have surveyed the region have found evidence of settlements dating back centuries, of a densely populated agricultural zone that supported the city's food needs. This zone is now much less densely settled, the population having contracted along with the city's economic fortunes. Walking that route in the morning, in the cool light before the heat arrives, you walk through layers of time. The path you are walking was walked by farmers and merchants for centuries. The pottery under your feet was made and used and broken by people who are long dead, but who were, in their moment, as present and as alive as you are now. The sand covers things. The desert is a great archivist of the wrong kind, preserving objects in ways that remove them from use, sealing them in layers of sedimented time. The sand that covers the pottery shards is the same sand that is slowly covering the lower courses of old buildings at the edge of Timbuktu. The sand that continues to advance, that the city continues to fight back, that has already won in many of the areas that were once suburbs and neighborhoods and farms. But walking through it, you are not walking through loss. You are walking through duration, through the persistence of a place across time that has not been uniformly kind to it. The river is at the end of the walk, the Niger in the morning light, the smell of water and vegetation, the sounds of birds and the movement of the current, the boats at the bank. The river continues. In the houses of Timbuktu, the evening meal is often eaten outside. The heat of the day has largely released by then, and the open air is more comfortable than the interior. Families gather, the older men and women seated on low stools or mats, the children moving around the edges of the gathering, the younger adults serving the food and filling the cups. The staple of the evening meal in the Sahel is often millet or sorghum, ground and cooked into a thick porridge that can be eaten with a sauce of vegetables and sometimes meat. The meal is communal, eaten from shared bowls rather than individual plates. There is tea afterward, the sweet, strong Saharan tea that is an institution across the region, served in small glasses in multiple rounds. The first round strong and bitter, the second somewhat sweeter, the third quite sweet, according to the local saying that the first is like life, the second is like love, and the third is like death. This meal has been eaten in this region for a very long time. The specific dishes have changed, the ingredients have evolved as new crops arrived and old ones disappeared or became less central. But the basic structure, the communal meal in the evening air, the tea afterward, the conversation, the mix of ages around the common gathering is old, very old. The scholars ate this meal. The merchants ate this meal. The scholars ate it between the day's teaching and the evening's writing. The merchants ate it after unloading caravans or closing deals in the market. The ordinary workers of the city ate it after whatever work had sustained the city that day. Food is not separate from civilization. Food is civilization. The ability to grow and prepare and share food in a particular way, to develop a cuisine that fits the climate and the resources and the social structures of a place, is one of the most fundamental expressions of a culture. The food of the Sahel, the millet and the sorghum, the dried fish and the preserved meat, the sauces that make nutritious but bland staples into something worth eating, the tea ceremony that structures the social interaction of the evening. All of this is as much a part of Timbuktu's culture as the manuscripts in the libraries, and it survives. In a way that the manuscripts almost did not, the food culture of the region persists. The evening meal in the open air, the tea in its 3 rounds, the communal bowl, changed and adapted and influenced by the centuries of contact and trade and disruption, but continuous, still there. The stars over the Sahara, as we said earlier, in this night's journey, are spectacular, but there is more to say about them. The astronomical manuscripts of Timbuktu, the texts that discuss the movement of the stars and the planets, the calculations of celestial positions, the application of astronomical knowledge to the practical purposes of timekeeping and navigation. These texts were written by people who lived with an extraordinary view of the night sky. People who had, from childhood, looked up at a sky undimmed by the light pollution that makes astronomy difficult or impossible in most of the modern world. The astronomers of Timbuktu knew the night sky, the way a city person knows their neighborhood, intimately, with the knowledge that comes from long familiarity, from noticing the small changes as well as the large ones, from understanding the patterns that repeat and the variations that do not. They observed the stars to determine prayer times, which in Islam are tied to the position of the sun and stars. rather than to a mechanical clock. They observe them to determine the direction of Mecca for prayer, which requires knowing where you are in relation to the holy city. They observe them to track the calendar, which in the Islamic tradition is a lunar calendar, dependent on the sighting of the new moon each month. But they also observed them because they were curious, because the stars were there, and they were the kind of people who looked at things and wondered about them. The astronomical texts in the Timbuktu collections include speculative discussions of the nature of the celestial bodies, of the distances between the Earth and the stars, of the structure of the cosmos. These are not purely practical texts. They are also philosophical texts, attempts to understand the universe in the deepest sense of that word. The scholars who wrote these texts would recognize, if they were here now, that the stars they observed are the same stars we observe. The constellations we identify by different names from theirs are the same arrangements of light. The universe that seemed to them to require explanation continues to require explanation. The curiosity that drove them to write about what they saw has not been resolved. It has only been extended. We know more about the stars now than they did. We also know that there is vastly more we do not know. The universe is larger and stranger and more complex than anyone in the 15th century imagined, and in some sense, it is also larger and stranger and more complex than we, in the 21st century, fully comprehend. The scholars of Timbuktu were working at the edge of what was known, trying to push it a little further forward. That is what scholars do. It is what the manuscripts record. The slow, collective, sometimes brilliant and sometimes mistaken process of trying to understand the world. They were doing it there, in the golden light of the late afternoon, in the cool of the library rooms, by the lamplight in the early morning hours before prayer. And we are doing it still. Somewhere on this planet, right now, in laboratories and in libraries and at kitchen tables, someone is trying to understand something, pushing the edge of what is known a little further forward, doing what the scholars of Timbuktu did. This is the thread, the long thread that connects us to them, across the centuries and the distances and the differences of language and culture and circumstance. We are all working on the same project, the project of trying to understand where we are and what this is and what we should do with it. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are not relics of a dead tradition. They are contributions to a living one. And now, truly, let the story rest. Let the city return to its night. Let the mosques stand in their quiet, the prayers done, the lights dimmed, the narrow streets empty. Let the manuscripts lie in their libraries, and their wrapped bundles, and their climate-controlled cases, and their sealed family rooms, patient as they have always been. Let the Niger flow south toward the Gulf of Guinea, carrying its slow, brown, patient water past the fishing villages, and the farming communities, and the boat builders, and the market towns that have depended on it since before any of our stories begin. Let the desert do what the desert does, which is exist, vast and indifferent, and in its own way beautiful, under a sky full of stars that no city light diminishes. Let the people of Timbuktu sleep. Let them dream whatever people dream when they sleep in a place that carries this much history. Perhaps they dream of the old stories. Perhaps they dream of the ordinary things, the daily concerns, the small anxieties and small pleasures that are the real texture of life in any city, in any era. Let the scholars in their universities and their archives dream of the manuscripts they have not yet read, the texts they are working toward understanding, the conversations they are trying to resume. Let the knowledge wait. It is good at waiting. It has been waiting for centuries, and it will wait a little longer, patient and accumulated and extraordinary, for the next person who opens the next manuscript and reads the next line of the next long argument about the nature of justice, or the movement of the stars, or the proper treatment of a sick patient, or the terms of a contested contract. The argument continues. The Golden City is real. It is still there. Good night. There is a word in Arabic, wistful and precise, that describes the feeling of standing before ruins and being moved by the memory of what was there. The word is atlal, meaning traces, remnants, the marks left by a camp long abandoned. The pre-Islamic Arabic poets built entire genres around this concept, standing before the traces of a departed beloved's campsite and using the ruins to structure a meditation on loss, time, impermanence. The scholars of Timbuktu knew this tradition. They had read those ancient Arabic poems, the qasidas that began with the poet standing at the traces, weeping, asking the ruins to speak. They had studied the grammar of those poems and the rhetoric of those poems. Some of them had written poetry in that tradition themselves, using those ancient forms to talk about their own experience of loss and longing. Now we stand before the traces of Timbuktu. Not physically, most of us, but in the imagination, which is where most of our encounters with the past take place. We stand before what remains, and we try to understand what was there. The trying matters. The fact that we are here, in whatever small hours this is for you, thinking about a city at the edge of the Sahara that most people dismiss with a laugh. This trying is part of the restoration of something that was diminished. Every act of genuine attention to a thing that has been overlooked is an act of repair. Timbuktu was magnificent. It was real. It is still there. It carries scars and diminishment and the accumulated weight of centuries of being undervalued. But it carries also the manuscripts and the mosques and the daily practice of prayer and the community of people who live in it and tend it and pass it forward to the next generation. It carries more than enough to be worth our attention. When morning comes to Timbuktu, the first thing you notice, if you are there, is the quality of the light as it arrives over the flat, almost featureless horizon to the east. There are no hills to delay the sunrise or complicate its arrival. The light simply comes, broad and warm and immediate, filling the entire sky at once with a reddish gold that precedes the sun itself by several minutes. In those minutes, before the sun actually appears above the horizon, the city catches the reflected light and glows. The mud brick walls, which are a pale ochre in the midday glare, deepen in the pre-sunrise light to something richer. The wooden beams that project from the mosque walls cast long early shadows. The sand in the streets, swept by the night wind into low ripples, holds the light at its surface. The call to morning prayer has already sounded. The faithful are already in the mosques, or turned in the direction of Mecca wherever they are, moving through the formal sequence of the morning prayer, the bowing and prostrating and rising that structures this most ancient of daily rituals. The city is waking, but it is waking slowly, in the particular rhythm of a city where the heat of the day is something to be paced against rather than fought. People know that the energy available to them will diminish as the day progresses and the temperature rises, and they organize their work accordingly, doing the heavier tasks in the morning, cool and resting in the worst of the afternoon heat, and resuming in the evening. This adaptation to climate is so embedded in the culture that it is invisible to the people who practice it. It is simply what you do, how you live. The architecture reflects it. The thick walls that retain the cool of the night into the heat of the afternoon, the small windows that minimize the entry of light and heat, the central courtyards that create shade and air movement. The rhythm of daily life reflects it. The timing of the market, the hours of the scholars' teaching sessions, the timing of the communal meal. All of this is knowledge, embodied, lived, daily knowledge about how to survive and how to live well in a specific environment, not written down in the manuscripts, not translated or digitized or studied by scholars at distant universities, but real knowledge accumulated over centuries of adaptation, as complex and as valuable in its own way as the jurisprudence debated in the legal texts. This knowledge is also at risk. The climate is changing, and the adaptations that worked for centuries may not work in the same way in a warmer, drier future. The rhythms that served the city for so long are going to need to change, and the change will require new knowledge, new adaptation, new invention. The people of Timbuktu are the heirs of a tradition that was very good at adaptation, that found a way to build a civilization in a desert landscape, that survived conquest and exile and drought and occupation, that smuggled its manuscripts to safety in rice sacks and canoes, that has, through everything, maintained the daily practice of prayer and community and the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. They will adapt again, because that is what they do, what they have always done. Before sleep comes entirely, one last thought. The joke about Timbuktu, the use of its name to signify the utterly remote and unknowable, tells us something about the speakers of that joke. It tells us about the limits of our imagination. about the places where we stopped being curious, about the easy dismissals we accept in place of actual knowledge. Every time someone uses Timbuktu as a punchline, they are, without knowing it, demonstrating the success of a particular historical project. The project of making West African civilization invisible, of removing it from the map of human achievement, of rendering it mythical, precisely because acknowledging its reality would complicate the stories we tell about who produces culture and who receives it. The punchline is not neutral. It is the residue of centuries of deliberate forgetting. But the manuscripts are not neutral either. They are the residue of centuries of deliberate remembering, of people who looked at what they knew and decided it was worth writing down, who looked at what others had written and decided it was worth copying and preserving, who looked at collections that had survived and decided they were worth protecting, even at the cost of great personal risk. The contest between the punchline and the manuscripts is not over. It continues in classrooms and textbooks and documentary films and casual conversations about Africa. It continues in the decisions made by the institutions that fund historical research about which histories to fund. It continues in the publishing industry's decisions about which stories to tell. But the manuscripts are winning, slowly and imperfectly and with inadequate resources and against the considerable inertia of established narratives, but winning, because the truth of what Timbuktu was is more powerful than the lie of what it supposedly was not, because the evidence, when it is properly examined and honestly presented, is overwhelming, because 25,000 students in a medieval university is not something that can be wished away once it is known. The Golden City is not a myth. It never was. It is waiting for the rest of the world to catch up with what it has always known about itself. And tonight, in whatever quiet place you are in whatever hour of the night or early morning this has become, you are a little closer to catching up. Sleep well. Let the story settle into whatever part of you receives and holds the things worth keeping. Let Timbuktu rest in the mind, patient and golden and real. Good night. There is something I want to say directly to you, whoever you are, in whatever room or bed or quiet corner you have found for this night. You chose to spend some of your time with a story about a place that the world treats as a joke. You chose to listen to something slow and long and careful about a city that most people do not think about at all. You chose to sit with the complexity and the beauty and the sadness of a civilization that was magnificent and was diminished and is still here, still alive, still fighting to be known. That choice says something about you. It says that you are the kind of person who can hold more than one thing at once, who can carry the knowledge of ancient empires and desert trade routes and stolen manuscripts alongside the ordinary weight of your own life and your own concerns, who is willing to let history be present in a way that is not comfortable or simple but is true. The truth about Timbuktu is not comfortable. It involves the trans-Saharan slave trade that was part of the city's economic foundation. It involves the colonial project that rendered the city's intellectual heritage invisible for generations. It involves ongoing poverty and insecurity, and a climate that continues to change in ways that threaten the already fragile conditions of human life in the Sahel. None of this is simple. None of this resolves into a clean narrative of triumph or tragedy. What it resolves into is something more honest. A story about a place where human beings did extraordinary things in difficult circumstances, where knowledge was created and preserved and passed forward across centuries of disruption, where the daily work of civilization continued, even when the conditions for it were terrible. A story that is still happening, right now, in the work of the scholars and the custodians and the communities that keep Timbuktu alive. You are part of that story now. Not dramatically, not in any way that will make it into a history book, but in the way that knowledge always travels, from one mind to another, across time and distance, carried by the simple and you paid attention to Timbuktu tonight. You let it be real to you, and in that small way, you participated in the project of restoration that the manuscripts and the mosques and the people of Timbuktu deserve. That matters. In the long timescales that this story has been operating on, it matters. Rest now. Let the story settle. Let the Golden City rest in its place, at the top of the bend in the Niger, under the extraordinary stars of the Saharan sky. patient and real and waiting. It has waited this long. It can wait until morning. Good night. There is one more question that lingers. A question that the story of Timbuktu poses to the present, to anyone who has spent time with it. The question is this: what are we doing with what we know? The scholars of Timbuktu believed that knowledge carried responsibility, that to know something was not simply to possess it, but to be accountable for it. If you knew about an injustice and did nothing, you were complicit in it. If you knew how to heal someone and withheld that knowledge, you had committed a kind of harm. If you understood the movements of the stars and failed to use that understanding to help the farmers and the travelers who depended on accurate knowledge of the seasons, you had failed in the duty that knowledge imposed. This is a demanding philosophy. It does not allow for comfortable passivity. It does not permit the excuse that you only know about things, that knowing is separate from doing. The scholars of Songhai Mosque would have recognized that as evasion. What do we do with what we know about Timbuktu? What do we do with the knowledge that West African civilizations built universities and libraries and intellectual traditions of extraordinary depth and sophistication, centuries before European colonialism arrived to claim that civilization was something it was bringing to Africa? What do we do with the knowledge that hundreds of thousands of manuscripts containing this tradition still exist, imperfectly preserved and underfunded, and vulnerable to the next crisis? We cannot all become scholars of the Timbuktu manuscripts. We cannot all travel to Mali and work in the Ahmed Baba Institute. We cannot all learn Arabic well enough to read the old texts in their original language. But we can stop using Timbuktu as a punchline. We can correct the joke when we hear it. We can pass this story on to the next person who might be ready to receive it. We can support, in whatever way is available to us, the organizations doing the work of preservation and translation and digital access. We can insist, in our own corners of the world, on the complexity of African history and African civilization, on the reality of places and peoples and traditions that the colonial story rendered invisible. These are small things. They are not small things. The manuscripts were preserved by thousands of small acts of protection across centuries, one person keeping one collection safe, one family maintaining one library, one community continuing one tradition. None of those individual acts was enough on its own. All of them together produced the survival of something extraordinary. Our individual acts of attention and respect and knowledge sharing are like that. Not enough on their own, necessary together. Timbuktu taught us this. The city itself was built and sustained by the accumulated small acts of the people who lived in it and worked in it and studied in it and traded in it and carried water to it. No single person built Timbuktu. All of them together did. Now let the silence finish the thought. Let the knowledge settle into the part of you that holds things worth keeping. Let the golden city rest in its place at the edge of the Sahara, patient and real, waiting for morning. You have been there now. You carry it with you. Good night. Sleep. The story is complete. Not the history, which continues in the daily lives of 30,000 people in a city on the edge of the Sahara. Not the work, which continues in the hands of scholars and custodians and community members who are doing the essential, underfunded, underappreciated work of keeping something alive that deserves to live. Not the reckoning, which is ongoing in the broader project of honestly confronting what was built and what was taken and what has survived. But this telling, this particular journey through the rise and ruin and persistence of Timbuktu is complete. We have traveled from the Green Sahara to the digitization projects of the 21st century. We have met the scholars and the merchants, the conquerors and the exiles, the manuscript smugglers and the families who kept their libraries sealed through every crisis. We have walked the desert routes and sat in the university at Songhai and watched the Moroccan guns fire at an army that had never faced anything like them. We have seen the manuscripts wrapped in cloth and loaded into canoes and carried to safety. We have seen the city diminished and the city persisting. We have seen the punchline and the truth beneath it. We have seen Timbuktu. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the golden city rest in the mind, warm and real and extraordinary. And let sleep come now. And let the morning bring whatever it brings. And let the story continue in whatever way the story continues. The manuscripts are there. The mosques are standing. The muezzin will call at dawn. Sleep well,